questions will just come up automatically. So that's all you have to do is press that. Oh, just that.
1, 2. Test. 1, 2. Test 1.
No, it's might get easier doing like this because people are
Sorry. Do you want? Yeah.
No.
Just
You guys stay.
anything liquid.
Yeah.
Thank you.
perfect. So I will. So Jenna, do you need? Just trying to think. No. Oops. No, sorry. Clara. Sorry, I accidentally pressed buttons. Sorry about that.
We're going to start. I need to tip the microphone up. Morning, everybody. There's still seats down near the front if anybody is stood up who wants to come and sit. I know people like to gravitate to the back, like people did at school when they gravitated to the back row of the bus, yeah? But there's plenty of room at the front if people still want to sit down. Morning, everybody. My name's Nick Bowes. I'm the Chief Exec at Centre for London. I wanted to, first of all, just thank everybody for joining us today, whether you're here in person or online, at this fantastic venue, which I've never been to before, and I'm sure many of you haven't either. Today, we're here to talk about London's next economy. Today's London economy is a powerhouse. It dominates the UK. It accounts for nearly a quarter of the country's total output. And it has an economic sphere of influence that ripples out well beyond the M25. And without London firing on all cylinders, the country would find it hard to pay its way in the world. The city's economy operates in a global marketplace, jostling with the likes of New York, Paris, Shanghai, and Singapore. It's home to world-class sectors, companies and institutions, and is a magnet for visitors. Some sectors, like finance and legal services, have been around for decades, even centuries. Some successors are more recent, like tech and life sciences. And some have seen a real renaissance in the last decade or so, like the screen industries. But we also know that for all of the success, the spoils are not shared by everyone. London is still home to some of the most deprived communities in the UK, sitting side by side with extreme wealth. And now London finds itself in a state of flux. For over 3 decades, London's economy has powered ahead, leaving the rest of the country in its wake. But we can't just assume that the city's ongoing success will continue into the future. The economy today is more fragile than it has been probably since the 2008 financial crash. Some of the fundamentals aren't heading in the right direction. Productivity growth is stalling. Skills shortages are holding back key sectors, and global talent risks going elsewhere. Brexit and the pandemic have disrupted trading patterns. Envious cities across the world are trying to lure away people, investment, and companies from London. Others want to steal a march on the next big growth sectors. And there's also a national political mood here in the UK, which at best takes London's future success for granted. That's why we can't rest on our laurels. But what about London's future economy? The challenge for us is that the future composition and strengths of London's economy are not givens. There is an opportunity for us to look ahead, shape good choices, and seize the opportunities for a more prosperous, fairer, and more sustainable economy. And during today's sessions, we're going to start those conversations, looking at where the city's economy will go next, at what might happen to the sectors where London has a track record of success, what the most likely prospects are for new areas of success and what we need to do to support them, what public policy needs to do to ensure London's future economy generates well-paid and secure jobs, how we make sure that more Londoners share in economic success in the future, and how we balance all of this with the overwhelming imperative to tackle climate change and achieve net zero. So it promises to be a lively and engaging discussion, and we've got a fantastic set of contributors and speakers today. On the back of today's conference, we're beginning a major new project on the future of London, called Rebooting London's Economy. We'll be grappling with exactly what needs to happen if we're to remain a globally successful city in the future. And a little plug for that, we are looking for partners to help us with this project. If it's of interest to you, please do grab me or any of my Centre for London colleagues. We're only happy to chat more about that project. And speaking of supporting our work, our supporters network is going from strength to strength. Many of you in the room are already members, but if you aren't, and you like what we do as an organisation and you want to be part of a much wider debate about some of the big policy issues facing London, then joining the Supporters Network is a great way to get more involved. Again, grab me or a colleague, and there's more information outside on the tables. Finally, just a few thank yous from me. Thank you to all of the sponsors for making today's event possible. We're only a small charity. Without the generous support of our partners, we simply can't put on events like today. Thank you to all of our speakers and panelists for agreeing to be part of today's proceedings. And thank you to Jenna for being our MC for today. And last but not least, thanks to all of my fantastic team at Centre for London who've worked so hard to make today happen. All that's left for me to say is that this will be my last Centre for London event as Chief Executive. So please enjoy today, and thank you once again for coming, and I'll hand over to Gemma.
I'll just adjust this. There's a slight height difference between Nick and I. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Centre for London conference. It's lovely to have you all here. Just to follow up on Nick's announcement right at the end there, the Chief Executive job of Centre for London is up for grabs. So get that word out to your networks, or if you're interested yourselves, all the information's on the website. It's obviously hugely important that a really strong and talented leader takes over this really important organisation. And on that note, I wanted to add my word of thanks to the sponsors as well, Central District Alliance, BID, London City Airport and the Crown Estate. And again, as a trustee for Centre for London, I just wanted to reiterate how important that support is. So again, if your organisation likes coming to these events or likes the work that Centre for London does and thinks it's important, as I am sure you do, please do get involved. A few points of housekeeping before we get to the good stuff. Sorry, this is still quite high up. I'll stand on my tiptoes. Can you all hear me okay? Great. A few points of housekeeping. There is a Slido. I hope many of you have used Slido before. The code is on your programme. It's catchy. 1969687, but it is on your programme, and that's how you ask questions today through that app. We won't be doing the kind of hands up thing. There are also people watching online, live stream, a nice group of people online, so we'll remember them while we're in this room, and I'll try and remember to take questions from them as well through Slido. Please do tweet, #LondonNext. There are no fire drills planned, so if it goes off, please make your way outside in an orderly fashion. We'll have a break at 11:10 and then end for lunch at 1, and then we're here until 2 to enjoy lunch and some networking. That's all from me. I was imagining the theme of today's conference is imagining that, yes, London is at a crossroads, and we've talked about that for the last few years, post-pandemic, post-Brexit. And today we're talking about what's on that signpost as you come to the crossroads. So which way do we want to go? Do we want to take the high road or the low road? I hope we want to take the high road. But here to fill in the blanks on what's on those signs, I think I'd like to invite our first speaker, which is James Murray, former Deputy Mayor for Housing, so a London board, current Labour MP for Ealing North, and Shadow Treasury Secretary to the Treasury. James.
I'm about halfway in between Nick and Jenna here, so there we go. Great. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. Well, look, firstly, thank you so much for having me along to speak here today. It's a real pleasure to be at Centre for London's conference discussing the future of London in the global economy. It's also a particular pleasure, if I might embarrass him for a moment, to speak at anything organised by Nick Bowes. I know from having worked with Nick closely at City Hall for 4 years that he's fiercely smart and thoughtful at any challenge he turns his attention to. And so I'd like to pay tribute to his time in the leadership role at Centre for London and wish him the very best for his future role at the London Communications Agency. When Nick and I were working together at City Hall, as Jenna mentioned, I was Sadiq's Deputy Mayor for Housing. And in that role, I knew how important it was to listen to and work closely with those on the front line delivering homes as we developed and implemented our home building plans. That meant listening to what developers, councils, housing associations, investors and residents had to say. It meant earning their trust, taking on board what they had to say and working together to get homes built. In much the same way, as a member now of the Shadow Treasury team, I know how important it is for us to work closely together with businesses as we develop our plans of what we would do in government to get our economy off its current path of managed decline. I know how important it is that we earn the trust of businesses of all sizes and in all parts of the country, so that if we win the next general election, we will be ready to work together to get our economy firing on all cylinders. Now, I think it goes without saying that that need for economic growth is desperate and urgently needed. A decade of low growth has left our economy weakened, with households feeling the impact as they struggle to make ends meet. And as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently found, despite the capital's high average incomes, the high cost of living here in London means that Londoners on lower incomes are amongst the most likely to be struggling with the spiralling costs of energy, food and services. And so, following many years of low growth, it is deeply concerning that the UK is set to be one of the worst performing major economies in the world this year, according to the IMF. The IMF has predicted that the UK economy will shrink this year, with our performance the worst amongst G20 economies, including sanctions-hit Russia. We need to get off this path of low growth. And to do so, I believe we need a government ready to provide the support that private enterprises need to succeed in the industries and the economy of the future. Now, for that reason, at the heart of our proposals in the opposition to get the economy growing lies our Green Prosperity Plan. This plan promises to provide catalytic public investment to crowd in private sector investment, helping to grow our clean energy capacity and green industries across the country. Now, this task is urgent, not least because of climate change, but also because the world economy is changing and other countries are pulling ahead. In the UK, we are investing 5 times less than Germany and roughly half of what France and the US are in green industries. From President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act to the programs coming out of Europe, Asia and Australia, the rest of the world is chasing the opportunities of the future, and we need to be in that race too. We need to make sure the UK, every part of the UK, including London, plays its part in delivering that economic growth. Now, here in London, the £48 billion green economy is already worth more than the construction and housing sectors combined. The Mayor of London rightly recognises the importance of green growth, and he has pledged to double the size of the green economy to £100 billion by 2030, a commitment that is critical to kickstarting greater job growth over the next decade. And what I believe is so important about that approach and about our approach in the national opposition is to see the opportunities that tackling the climate emergency present to boost economic growth. Because I think for many years, there has been a perceived tension between measures that support economic growth and measures that tackle climate change. We reject that tension. Indeed, we want to make clear that greening our country and the creation of new jobs and wealth are two sides of the same coin. In supporting clean energy, insulating homes across the country, and helping new green industries to succeed, our Green Prosperity Plan will help tackle the climate emergency and grow the economy at the same time. This long-term plan signals how in government we would move our economy away from sticking plaster approaches to the challenges we face. Instead, we believe the national government should provide the stable and secure platform for people, businesses and trade unions to work together to succeed. And that is why, alongside shifting our economy to the green industries of the future, we also need to make sure that London and the whole of the UK is the best place to start and grow a new business. That means reforming business rates, something I know it never takes long for the conversation to turn to whenever I speak with local businesses in London and elsewhere about the challenges they face. My colleague, the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, has committed that in government we would abolish the business rate system, which currently places an unfair burden on small and high street businesses, and we would replace them with a fair system fit for the 21st century. The Shadow Chancellor has also, at the end of last year, published our new report, Start-up, Scale-up, which sets out how we would make Britain the best place in the world to start and grow a new business. This report, from a review led by Lord Jim O'Neill, makes clear how in government we would tackle the problems that start-ups face in accessing finance, and we would help them to remove some of the stubborn obstacles that prevent them from growing. And of course, supporting businesses means fixing the holes in the Brexit deal. something that is particularly crucial to supporting the City of London and the wider UK finance sector. Now, whilst helping businesses to flourish is essential for economic growth, we also need to make sure that people across London and across the country are able to benefit from the job opportunities that arise. That means supporting people of all ages and all places to develop the skills they need to fulfil their potential and contribute to a growing economy. I know that here in London, the Mayor is already using a £330 million a year adult education budget to support 200,000 Londoners a year to upskill. That is a crucial part of driving economic growth and productivity. And we in the national opposition want to see a national focus on giving people the skills they need for the jobs of the future. And that is why we set out our plans to improve the flexibility of the apprenticeship levy, turning it into a growth and skills levy to boost training and skills. At the same time, we would give more power and flexibility to local areas to run employment support services, and we would strengthen the protections afforded to all workers, from banning 0 hours contracts to ending qualifying periods for basic rights. We are showing what it means to be proudly pro-business, pro-worker, and pro-growth. Now, of course, building the economy of the future I've set out today only works if the foundations are strong. That means making sure people are healthy, and it means making sure they have a decent, secure, and affordable home that meets their needs. On the latter, it won't surprise you to know I could speak for hours. But let me simply say to you here today, you should be in no doubt how crucial we know it is for Londoners to have a private rented sector that is fit for purpose, to be able to buy their first home, and to see more council and social housing being built. But more widely, the strong foundations for our economy also means having a government you can be confident in, to provide long-term stability that will give families and businesses and public institutions like Transport for London the long-term certainty they need to plan. Let me give you an example, a very timely example, of the problem we face. This afternoon, I will be leading for the opposition in the House of Commons on the Finance Bill. That bill includes changes to corporation tax and capital allowances. I'm sure you'll all be watching it on the Parliament channel. But if not, let me tell you what will be coming up. Because with corporation tax being increased, we know how important it is for businesses to get capital allowances right to ensure we are encouraging investment in this country. Yet today, rather than a long-term plan, what we will be considering is a temporary change to capital allowances that will only last for 3 years. Now, that kind of temporary change only brings forward investment rather than increasing it overall, and the Office of Budget Responsibility has confirmed this. They've shown that business investment between 2022 and 2028 is essentially unchanged. If anything, it falls slightly, and that is the price of uncertainty. And that is why we have said that if we were in government, we would review the business tax system and set out a clear roadmap to help boost investment. Now, to bring my comments full circle, that importance of certainty and stability is something I saw the benefit of very clearly during my time at City Hall. When Sadiq was first elected, we introduced for the first time a new, simpler, flat rate for affordable housing requirements and also for social housing grant. That helped to give home builders of all sorts the certainty they needed to plan and invest, and it helped boost affordable home building in the capital to record levels. If we were to win the next general election, we would bring that stability and certainty so badly needed in national government. We would do so not just by putting country before party, but also by respecting strong and trusted economic institutions, with the government providing the certainty that businesses need to invest. By providing those foundations, by helping businesses to seize the opportunities of the future, and by making sure every person in every part of the country is able to play their part, we can move our country off its path of managed decline. We want to support businesses in the capital to grow, and we want all Londoners to be able to benefit from these opportunities. We want to see London and the whole of the UK take a leading position in the global economy of the future, not be left behind as other countries and their cities pull ahead. We know that success in the economy of the future will be thanks to the talents and efforts of millions of working people and businesses in every part of the country. Now those people and businesses, I believe, need a government who will enable them to succeed. Thank you. Now, I've been told the questions are on Slido, and I'm interested how this works. Are they behind me?
Or
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it kind of votes how many votes each question has got. So if you go from the top, that's the most popular question.
Right.
See down.
Fantastic. This is great. They should do this when I do interviews on TV, and I can just see them. So can we talk about growth being agnostic? How about health, happiness, and social cohesion as metrics for success? Yeah, I think, look, when we talk about growth, one of the issues talking about growth is that it can feel abstract to people. We talk about GDP, we talk about percentages, we talk about international comparisons with the G7 or the G20 or the OECD. And I think when you're trying to communicate with people across the country, those kind of metrics sometimes can be hard to translate into what people see in their everyday life. But if you look at the impact of low economic growth, I think people are very clear what impact that has on their everyday life, because with real wages having been so stagnant over the last decade, people's spending power, people's ability to look after themselves and their family is massively decreased. People know that the amount of tax revenue coming in to support public services is decreased, which means the government has had to put up taxes to help fund public services. So I think across the board, although we might talk about GDP in percentage terms and in terms of the G7, the G20, the OECD comparators and so on, it means something to the everyday life of people across the country, because it means that they and their families struggle to make ends meet. And I think if we can make clear that that is the challenge that we want to take on, we can make clear the difference that having an economy on a better growth path can make. Right. Next one. Childcare is belatedly being recognised as infrastructure essential to the economy, yet 2/3 of nurseries are at risk of closure. Yes. So look, childcare. What was really interesting in the budget around this time last month is that, as is often the case in opposition, we're calling for various things to be included in the budget. And we were pleased that the government was talking about childcare on budget day. We have some concerns about the detail of the plans, how they're going to be implemented, what credibility they have, and so on. But the very fact that on budget day we were talking about childcare is a good thing, because I think it's just as important when we're talking about infrastructure to recognise childcare as infrastructure alongside roads and railways and power stations that we more often think of in debates when we think about infrastructure. That infrastructure about making sure that young people have the best start in life, and also that parents can go back into work, I think is an essential part of our infrastructure. And as I said, we can have a long debate about the government's plans and what they've set out, but the very fact we were talking about childcare on budget day is a good thing. Right. Abolishing business rates will impact bids reliant on levy income. Will new funding opportunities be available for bids? So look, I think, as I said during my speech, whenever I talk to businesses here in London or across the country about their wish list, it takes about 3 seconds for business rates reform to come up, because business rates is something which I think impacts businesses across the piece, particularly small businesses, high street businesses, and people want to see the system reformed. Now, we had discussions under the government of fundamental change. In our view, that pledge has not been delivered. And so what we said we would do is replace the current system of business rates with one fit for the 21st century, because what we need is a business rate system which incentivises growth, which incentivises investment, and which recognises the burden that the current rate of business rates puts on those bricks and mortar premises, whilst the online giants, some of the large multinationals, don't necessarily pay their fair share. And I think that's what it comes down to, because when we're setting out our plans for the tax system, the driving principle for us is making the tax system fairer. Now, we know the tax burden at the moment is the highest in 70 years, but it's also deeply unfair. If you look at the way that the loopholes and so on have developed, which allow people to not pay their fair share of tax, and in this case, companies not necessarily to pay their fair share of tax if they're large multinationals sending their profits overseas. So that's why we believe a whole series of reforms are necessary, and in fact, in a timely reference, again, this afternoon, when you're all watching me on the Parliament channel this afternoon, you'll see my comments about the global deal about a minimum global corporation tax rate, which has been a deal developed by the OECD to implement a floor on global corporation tax rates. And we believe that kind of innovation is essential to make sure there isn't a race to the bottom, to make sure there's a level playing field for British businesses with large multinationals, and to make sure we get that much needed income for British public services. will Labour address the elephant in the room in terms of the UK's weak performance against G20 countries and commit to at least a customs union? I think this is about Brexit, is it? Yeah, I can't read the end of the question, but I think I get the gist. Look, for us, the debate about Brexit is over. It's happened. We're not going to go back on our commitments around the single market and the custom union. But what we do believe is essential is to make Brexit work. The last government went into the election with a slogan, "Get Brexit done." We believe now it's time to make Brexit work. Because the truth is, the deal was a bad deal to start with, and we want to improve it. We want to make sure we get the best possible opportunities for the UK. And I think that's particularly important for London. For London with its trading relationships with the rest of Europe, and of course the City of London and its role in the UK financial sector. So for us, it's a question of making Brexit work. Now, I don't think making Brexit work is something that's ever going to be achieved through headlines, through grand statements, or through trying to pick fights with our nearest neighbours. I think making Brexit work is something which will only be achieved by sitting down, rolling up your sleeves, and having those difficult conversations, those detailed conversations, and putting in some hard graft to solving some of the thorny issues. Because if we do that, if we had a government who could work with the European Union in an atmosphere of goodwill and cooperation to try and improve the Brexit deal, I believe that would be for the UK's benefit and for London in particular. And so I'm taking this hint that I should probably wrap up my comments right now. This is all very well managed, isn't it, in this screen? So I'd like to just close, again, by thanking you all very much for listening to me. I hope you, again, enjoy my comments on the Parliament channel later this afternoon. Thanks very much to Nick, thanks to Jenna, and thanks to Centre for London. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And if your question wasn't answered by James, it will remain on Slido, I believe. So you might get a chance to ask it of somebody else, perhaps our next speaker. I'd like to invite to the stage Paul Scully, MP, the Minister for London, of course, and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. Paul, please.
Thank you so much, and let me start by saying a massive thank you to Nick and all the team for organising such an impressive array of speakers. We've only had James so far, but very impressive, and we're going to have many more later on. So it's going to be a fantastic day, I know, for you. So and going through some of the topics that we have, it's always a privilege to take part, and it's a real tribute to everybody that works at the Centre of London that these conferences have become such a cornerstone of London's political calendar. Now, it's just over a decade since the Centre of London was first founded, and over that period it's grown to be a real essential part of the policy-making landscape in London. And it's events like today that help us to exchange ideas between different sectors and industries, and across local, regional and national institutions. But let me just start by reflecting on a few of my thoughts on the theme of London's future economy before handing back into the joy of Slido for further debates and questions. It's often said that to explore the future, you've got to first understand the past. And it's important then that we take stock of where London's economy stands today before considering where it might go next. What are its key strengths, and what are those major challenges as we go into the next chapter of London's great history? Now, all of us are going to be aware of London's strengths, including the vibrant and dynamic business environment, its diverse and highly educated workforce, the world-leading sectors from tech and finance. I've just come from a fintech conference across the way in Guildhall, to life sciences and creative industries, its well-connected public transport system, especially in the centre of London, and its world-leading cultural assets and higher education institutions. But we know that there are a lot of challenges as well. That higher cost of living, higher cost of housing, the difference in skill levels and job opportunities across the city, the differences in economic performances of different parts of the capital, and pockets of entrenched socio-economic disadvantage as well. Now, none of these challenges are unique to London, but they are a timely reminder that many of the starkest geographical inequalities exist within rather than between our cities and regions. And that's just one of many reasons why I'll always continue to say loudly and clearly that levelling up does not mean dampening down the success of London. Rather, it's about improving living standards and spreading opportunities more equally across all parts of the country, including London. It's about levelling up people. And that's why I was pleased to see London included in the last round of the Levelling Up Fund announced earlier this year, with a further 8 projects sharing in over £150 million worth of new funding. From step-free access at Colindale and Leighton tube stations to improving the physical and community infrastructure around Camden. They're just a few of the projects that will make a tangible difference to the everyday lives of Londoners. And all of this comes on the back of significant investments in London's high streets, £56 million, and Crossrail, more than £18 billion, and the East Bank project at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Parks, over £168 million from government, to name just a few projects. But as I've said before on this platform, what's good for London is good for the UK. For every £1 that's spent on London's transport, 55 pence is spent on average elsewhere in the country. £1.25 billion used in Battersea Power Station was procured from 72 different places across the UK. But we've got to engage in a more nuanced debate that recognises the symbiotic relationship between London and the rest of the country. One great example, when I talked about Battersea Power Station, is we can often say that those 72 areas benefited from Battersea Power Station and that £9 billion regen project in London. Rather, Battersea Power Station would not have happened without those 72 areas sharing their services, their products, and their labour as well to make that single regen project happen that's now known across the world. And that's the symbiotic impression. That's the language that we need to use to make sure this isn't a north versus south divide. This isn't a London versus everybody else divide. When we talk about levelling up, we all have our issues that we've got to tackle. We can only tackle them as partners together. But finally, as we look to the future, we also need to recognise the different spatial levels and how London operates. Because often we'll go back into our silos. If we're in the centre of London, we'll always look at the central activity zone. And if you're a global investor, as I say, I've just left in fintech, they will see London as the city, the Tower of London. They'll see the West End, etc. If you are living in Havering, in Bromley, in Sutton, Barnet, you'll be looking at the city of villages that are that London is part of. But it's also our nation's capital as well, and that global business hub, and it's a shop window for UK PLC. So it does operate. London operates simultaneously at a global, national, and at a local city level. We've got to recognise all of those three spaces and make sure that we can address all three of those, often simultaneously. It means that wherever London's economy is heading next, we have to make sure that it works for both Londoners, the UK, and business leaders from around the world. And we have to acknowledge that balancing those different interests will sometimes involve trade-offs and difficult decisions. And I know some of those Slido questions before, where you're talking about happiness and social mobility indexes rather than just GDP. All of those have to be catered for when we're looking at London's economy and London's cohesion. But we should look to the future with hope, not fear. London has been here before, and it's adapted successfully to major changes in the global economy since Dick Whittington was a boy. Now, where once the City of London and Docklands were at the centre of the physical exchange of goods, today they're at the leading edge of selling professional, technical and digital services. The emerging plans for a new life science cluster at Canada Water and Canary Wharf are just the start in a major boom of London's life sciences sector. And as Minister for Tech and Digital Economy, I'm here to tell you that London is now firmly established as the Silicon Valley of Europe, with venture investment in tech increasing from $100 million in 2010 to over $25 billion in 2021. These are hugely amazing achievements. We shouldn't forget these achievements when we look at the difficulties and look at the challenges. Places like London, certainly our economy are based on confidence, they're based on optimism, based on aspiration as well. And we have to keep that in mind. Look at the fundamentals of London's economy as we judge it and as we look for the solutions for the future. All of those things should give us all hope that London's economy will not only survive, but it will thrive well into the future. And I look forward to working with all of you to seize those opportunities. Thank you. Cool, here we go. Well, Andrew Campling, what should be done to repair London's position as a global financial centre and to make London, the UK, more welcoming to overseas university students? Well, I talked a little bit about the fundamentals of as a global financial centre. You've taken that off deliberately, haven't you, just to wind me up with that second line question. London still remains certainly the number one financial centre in Europe, no doubt about that, by some way, by some distance. It's competing with New York, it's competing with Hong Kong and other cities in Asia. But it remains the choice, the venue of choice for people around the world. Why? Because of the rule of law, because of the language, because of the time zone, the location between Atlantic and between America and Asia and those other markets. But we can't take that for granted. We certainly can't take that for granted. I talked about the fact that the UK, about London, remains the shop window for the UK, and predominantly it is the city. That the shop window will be partly there from when we see the coronation, the cultural background of London. But when you have businesses coming from around the world, they all look to the City of London. And when I speak to Indian businesses, I ask them, how do you see the UK? They will always see it through the prism of the City of London. That's where deals are done. That's where bonds are traded, currencies traded, that's where insurance is traded, and also the amount of legal firms that are basing themselves in London as well is phenomenal. But so much of the high growth that we're going to be going through is through technology, and there's no accident the UK has reached a $1 trillion ecosystem, the only third country in the world to achieve that. We've attracted more venture capital than the next 13 European countries. That's all predominantly coming through London. But as I say, we cannot rest on our laurels within that. Can't even remember the second bit of that question now, but let me tackle this head on. Am I considering running for London Mayor in 2024? Yes, I am considering it. I haven't made a decision yet, but it's something that, frankly, we need, if we're going to get London working, if we're going to keep London as the top city in the world, there are certain things that the mayor does. And frankly, I just want to make sure that they get done, whoever is the mayor of London. That is making sure that, first of all, we can stay safe in the city. That's an absolute fundamental thing. That we can house people, not just ourselves, but our children, our grandchildren, people that want to come to this country, which reminds me of the second part of the last question. But also keep London moving, and that's not just from having great public transport in the centre of city, but making sure, because lots of people can't afford to be in the centre of the city, so we need to make sure that we have good transport alternatives, including the car. And the ULEZ expansion does concern me because it drags down that social mobility that we were talking about, and the happiness index that some people were talking about. Sutton, my constituency, is the fourth highest borough for people driving to and from work, and it's not because people don't want to get on public transport, it's just that the transport is not there for them to do so we need greater investment in those alternatives before you're having those punitive approaches. And so when you've got the police in special measures, you've got the fire brigade in special measures, you've got Transport for London that's in financial dire straits, and you've got not enough housing being built, we need a change, and that's what's driving me to look at this. The second part of the former question about overseas students, look, I come back to my digital hat on. We need to do more around digital skills in this country, and that's not just digital. It won't be hospitality, it's lots of different sectors. So the base level has got to be that we build up domestic a workforce that have got the skills that are required, and we've got a great start in London, but we're never going to have everything we need from domestic. So we've got to make sure that we can separate the debate about the boats in the channel and about attracting the brightest and the best across the world to innovate, to make sure that we have people, innovators and entrepreneurs and people with the skills that we need right the way through from our restaurants through to our big tech sector. All of those things are possible. Right, what will the rapid growth of AI-type technology mean for London's professional services sector, and what, if anything, should government do about it? So you'd have seen that we've just launched the AI white paper, and it's our first approach to, and it's pretty well a world-leading first approach to how we might regulate AI, and it's working with the sector, with the AI sector, to make sure practitioners, ethicists, as well as developers, to make sure that we can get our framework right. We want to make sure that we're working on this in the same way that we should have worked on online safety about 20 years ago. So we've learnt our lesson from that, having had 5 years of trying to get the online safety bill through, to have been an early adopter of a light touch AI regulation, having regulatory sandboxes so that businesses and government can try out different methods of regulation to see what works. Because good regulation gives consumers, it gives customers, it gives companies certainty. It gives you confidence. Bad regulation just acts as a cost to business. So it's really important that we get it right, because we know that AI will create future jobs that we haven't even thought of yet. And so people's jobs will be changing. We have to be really alive to that to make sure that we can make the most of it, rather than actually see great parts of our services be automated and then wonder what happened to the workforce. This is all developing at an incredibly fast pace, and it's important that, again, we co-create solutions with people within the sector. How can we better support London's green economy, including skills development and ensuring cleaner air? So first of all, skills development, I think one of the big things that we need to look at is retrofitting. Obviously, we a lot of talk, I've talked about it just a few minutes ago, about the ULEZ expansion, tends to boil down to certain things that trigger people at a particular time, because it directly affects them without that longer term thinking ahead. And if you actually look at what's causing a lot of pollution, a lot of energy inefficiency, it is our buildings, and so there's more work that we need to do there, because London doesn't lend itself to particularly having a greater well-insulated set of buildings, because it's grown up over 1,000 years, and so we have an amazing array of buildings within the UK and within London, but we've got to do more to build up the skills to be able to retrofit within that. But within this, about cleaner air, the key thing is we have to take people with us on the journey. We can't get through this a principled point of view and stand in an ivory tower and wag our fingers at people. That way just lays ruin. It's just not. It's an egotistical approach. We have to make sure that people can join us on that journey. And we've seen this in other areas. We've seen it in recycling. We've seen it in the gradual adoption of electric cars. We've seen it in people's day-to-day behaviours. We need to accelerate some of that, but it doesn't have to be punitive. You have to have the carrot as well as the stick. How do you ensure support is provided to London small businesses to innovate instead of focusing on large and more established businesses? Well, this was a role that I had during COVID over 2.5 years as Minister for Small Business. When London is changing, I talked a lot about London changing again and moving to that next chapter. You know, we're here in Aldgate, the City of London, right on our doorstep, and it's a really good case in point when you have these massive multinational companies. And one of the reasons that the city was probably the last to come back in London into the office, and hasn't fully come back now, is because banking, legal services, etc., lends itself partly to remote working. A sandwich shop doesn't. So how do you actually tackle that difference? How do you make sure that we don't get this Gotham City scenario, that the middle classes choose not to come to London because the joy has left London, which hollows out the centre of town, may cause antisocial problems as it did in New York in the 70s and 80s, but certainly will affect those small businesses. We need to make sure that the discussions we were having 15 years ago when I was a local councillor about how our high street's going to be looking in 15 years' time, now accelerates to what does a high street look like in a year's time, 18 months' time. And one thing I do agree with James on, not necessarily the end result, is what we do with our business rates regime. Because smaller businesses in London, you just can't survive. It's so difficult to survive when you've got those high-level business rates. The West End collects more business rates than the whole of Wales. Now imagine if you're a small independent retailer trying to compete in that. It's so difficult. So we do have to have a more flexible solution to do that. And just covering the other question in that, and actually the next question, business improvement districts. If we do change the business rates regime, we need to make sure that business improvement districts can not just survive but thrive, because they have a massive role to play in supporting small businesses, in supporting hospitality, retail, and the very vibrancy of our local areas as well. I'm getting the push on here. Are we done? Fantastic. Well, can I once again thank you, all of you, and I really hope you have a successful rest of conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for your questions as well, including those watching online. The huge amount there between James Murray and Paul Scully that I think will wet our whistles for discussions as we go on through the conference. Some real macro issues, talking about the future green economy, to the more granular issues around local businesses and business rates reforms in London. With no further ado, though, I'd like to invite our next speaker to the stage. Dr. Linda Yu is an economist. She works at Oxford University and the London Business School, has a hugely impressive CV, which I don't have time for now, but I'll let Linda come to the stage and tell you herself.
Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here. I actually don't have anything else to add to my intro. I'm an economist. I'll try my best not to depress everyone, but this will not be a depressing session, because I'm going to be joined in a moment by a fantastic panel to talk about London's next high-value jobs and industries. We're going to look in two main areas, which is what are the industries that will drive London's future growth, which sectors are here to stay, moving away from London or set for a comeback. And I think most importantly, what does London need to do now to have the talent and infrastructure to be ready for these key industries for the future? So as with all the sessions, this is hybrid. So please, for those of you who are joining us online, feel free to join in the conversation using the hashtag LondonNext. And for those of you in the audience, I think you've already submitted some fantastic questions. So we'll take questions for the last 10 minutes of this session as well. So please put those into Slido, and I will come to those after hearing the initial thoughts of our panelists. So can you please join me in welcoming onto the stage a great panel. I'll introduce them all at once, and then they'll come up, and then we'll give them a good round of applause. And I'm sure they will earn this applause. This is always the danger of applauding before a panel speaks. So we're going to be joined by Indy Johar. He's the co-founder and director of Dark Matter Labs, by Councillor Elizabeth Campbell, leader of the Council, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and executive member for London's Future, Business, Economy and Culture for London Councils, by Tim Haley, who is the Director of Infrastructure and Planning at London City Airport, and by Alex Kim, Director of Workplace at the Crown Estate. Please join me in welcoming them onto the stage. Right. So I'm going to actually start with you, Indy, if that's okay, just as you're picked up your mic and get seated. So I find this absolutely fascinating, this concept of a civic economy. So can you just tell us a bit about what Dark Matter Labs is aiming to build in terms of the underlying infrastructure to support this new civic economy? And what does it mean for ownership, legal systems, governance, accountancy, insurance? How might all of that begin to change?
Okay. Yeah. So I suppose I'm going to be really tight and fast. One, I don't think we're having an honest conversation here earlier. The scale of change that London is about to see is of an order of magnitude that we're not talking about appropriately. So when people talk about national carbon budgets, right? So if we're according to the Paris Carbon Accord, all of the UK can afford to build 14,000 homes. If we're within the Paris Accord, 14,000 homes. All of Europe, 140,000 homes. All of Europe, right? Just to give you a scale. So our hydrocarbon economy is going to be fundamentally transformed at an order of magnitude we don't have the capacity to do at the speed that we're talking about. Our food systems are absolutely perilous. Within the next 2 years, we're going to have a systemic food crisis. We can't afford to retrofit all of the UK if you look at the carbon burp that's available. So we're talking mythos. We're talking absolute, like, pipe dreams in terms of the transition that London faces. Right? In terms of the material economy, in terms of the hydrocarbon base of our economy, all the way forward. So then if you talk about the transition that we're facing, we're facing a foundational economy transition. If we want to make London resilient, the highest value jobs will be teachers. Because we're going to have to re-educate and build new human capacity in a new way. That's the fundamental. We're going to have to massively invest in mental health. This is going to be foundational to the next economy. So let's not imagine a kind of mythos in these discussions. We're going to have to reimagine our energy economy and our material economy if we can't afford to build virtually anything. So I think we're going to have to reimagine our investment in biodiversity. UK is the most nature depleted economy in the world. So when we talk about this civic economy, it's about collective intelligence of London. That is going to be a key asset. It won't be about your individual intelligence. It'll be about the intelligence of a place, mental health of a place, the biodiversity of a place, the material economy of a place. London has been really fortunate that we've accrued vast amounts of material into London over the last 20 years, because we won't be able to afford that material economy anymore. Not just UK, but pretty much most of the world. So when we start to talk about this, I think we're seeing a much more fundamental shift into these forms of integrated goods, like collective intelligence, like mental health, like effectively biodiversity, and how we share our public resources in radical ways. They're going to be foundational to our next economy. We're going to have to transform our food systems. Our food systems are systemically non-resilient. They are financed for effectively the efficiency of capital, not the resilience for shocks. How do we do that? How do we build the resilience? How do we build the quality of our food systems in radical terms? So for me, the civic economy is about these entangled goods, which are foundational transition places for the next economy. And without that investment, I don't think we get there. And I think we have to be much more honest about the scale of transition London is facing, not to scare us, but to actually mobilize us to do the transitions, rather than just imagining this is like 1990s. We'll just tinker along with a little bit of market-adjusted growth. It's not like that.
Thank you very much, Indy. I am a little scared. Elizabeth, can I turn to you? You've taken a leading role in a number of local government networks, identifying strategic actions to support the capital's economic recovery and future growth. So, in your view, from your experience, which industries do you see driving London's future growth?
Well, I'd just like to respond first to what you're saying. I mean, I think we are looking at just fundamental change coming down the tracks. And the first thing I think we need to also look at is what government and London government does about that. Because at the moment, all our decisions are so centralised by central government that we don't really have the powers to alter quite a lot of policy stuff that is coming. And one of the things that we're looking at cross-party in London and with London councils and with the mayor is really forming a platform together actually with businesses and universities up for London and actually to push for devolution so that we can be a little bit more nimble on our feet, because I agree with you, if we're not, it's going to be very difficult. And I noted Paul Scully was saying, AI is coming and the government is regulating, but I thought, wow, well, I wonder whether he agrees with the chief exec of Google, who said it keeps him awake at night, and that they've got this new chatbot Lambda, which is already translating Bengali, but it hasn't actually been taught to do so. So these new neural networks, I think, are going to be really interesting. So to go back to your question, what will drive London? I suspect quite a lot of the businesses which are here already. So fintech, Paul commented on, that's worth billions of pounds here. And as he said, okay, it's down 8% over the last year, but it's still worth more than 13 other countries' fintech stuff put together. Then there's the whole thing about life sciences, 100,000 people employed in life sciences. Finance, of course, London contributes 10% of the UK's GDP. A lot of people were asking during the last session about the green economy. We're expecting the green economy to triple by 2050. We'll need 3 times as many people in it. Sorry, not 3 times. It's worth 40 billion at the moment. And then also what Paul talked about was the creative industries. Again, 100,000 people involved, 200 films produced every year. So I think that there are a lot of challenges, but we do have a really great base to build on. And so I am actually quite optimistic about the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to you, Tim, because we hear a lot about deglobalization. We hear a lot about Zoom meetings and being more domestically focused. You actually, you've got a great perch in terms of seeing what's actually happening. So how much of London's future growth do you see, which is will still be based on trade, on international investment, collaboration, versus a switch to more domestically focused activities?
Yeah. I think in general, yes, there has been a lot of speculation about how business might recover, and in particular the need to travel for business. And we've certainly seen that firsthand over the past 18 months or so. And what we are seeing is a return to travel, and people are still travelling for business. And whilst there is definitely a hybrid model there, we are seeing a return. We're potentially about 75% of pre-pandemic levels this year, we hope, and we see that continuous recovery. But what we're also seeing is people are still travelling for leisure as well, and we, as an airport in East London, are very proud of the market we serve in terms of business in London, and will continue to serve that particular side of things as well as an increasing amount of leisure travel from our passengers. But it's not lost on us that there's a massive challenge here for us as an industry and as an airport in general in terms of the climate change challenge. We recently published our plans to achieve net zero operations by 2030 and support the aviation sector and our airlines to achieve their goals as well. But it's not lost on us that that's going to have a massive challenge for all of us, really. But I think it's not lost on us that connectivity is key to a successful economy in terms of attracting talent to London, in terms of business and in terms of inward investment and travel. But that needs to be balanced against what we think is the biggest challenge as to how we achieve zero emissions flight. We're involved at the moment with a number of partners looking at Project Napkin with the likes of Rolls-Royce and universities. How do we look to decarbonise and achieve zero emissions flight? And London City Airport is actually ideally placed in that respect, given our route network is more regional and domestic, smaller aircraft, and that lends to potential acceleration and us potentially leading the way in that respect over the next 10 or so years, alongside all of the other challenges that we'll be focusing on too.
Great, thank you. Alex, can I turn to you in terms of, thinking about the perspective of from the Crown Estate? Obviously, you see London's ecosystem. In central London, there's an ecosystem between businesses, office workers, tourism, hospitality, leisure, commercial. So post-pandemic, how vulnerable is this ecosystem to the changing patterns of work that we're beginning to touch on, as well as leisure? And how do you read that into what it could mean for London's future?
Thank you. Probably a good example of the privilege of being a sponsor sat here amongst you all. Thank you. I think the property, and perhaps there's some parallels with an airport, is an interesting bellwether, perhaps. It's, by its very physical nature, slow-moving and not something that can, beyond a certain amount, speed up. There's a physical labour required, a physicality that restrains it. And I think what we therefore are is an interesting opportunity to compare what people say and what people do with their physical commitment to premises. And I think that's a really interesting thing for the Crown Estate, because we, whilst a lot has been spoken of the City of London this morning, the Crown Estate's operation is firmly in the West End. But even within the West End, we encompass and manage an estate which touches different districts, Soho, Fitzrovia, Mayfair, St James's. And you might say that, well, they're all just within touching distance, but actually the communities that exist in those different districts are very distinct. And so through our activity, I think we are afforded an interesting visibility and a prism to explore the ecosystem of London, perhaps on a more granular level. There are creative, there are educational, there are research-based businesses, there are financiers. And what we've seen is perhaps perverse to the outsider, a great resilience across our office portfolio, but also the retail portfolio. And that's not to say that there hasn't been a huge amount of distress and difficulty. That would be a silly thing to say. But what we have seen is both a resilience to London, and particularly in the West End, but also significant growth in certain sectors. And we're crudely exposed to banking and finance, but it's the contrarian end of that spectrum. And so in the West End, we've seen both new entrants in terms of venture capital, particularly from the US, and we've also seen the private equity customer base that we have expand enormously. And that, I think, is a very interesting dynamic, because at the same time, we've also seen legacy businesses like Apple, Twitter, Google, Facebook, all potentially contract, or at least state that they plan to contract, all the while during the pandemic expanding their footprint. And there's again, going back to that idea of what people say, what people do. And perhaps all of the sectors which perhaps we thought were more likely to be more cost concerned and more ruthless in their decision making have actually doubled down on their space and grown. And actually those who we might have envisaged to have been more progressive and at surface level actually have a reckoning. And that's been a fascinating experience for us. I think very different to others.
Fascinating, thank you. Indy, can I come back to you and just have you highlight what infrastructure do you think we really need to be focused on?
Okay, so I'll pick two for the purposes of this conversation. One, actually, how do we make decisions as London? Our societal decision-making structure is no longer fit for purpose, right? And I think we need to be honest about our ability as societies to make decisions at the speed and relevance that's required. And I think that is going to be any major government that comes in that wants to actually be able to address the challenges that we face, I think is going to have to reinvent that. And quite fundamentally, how do you build that shared commitment across London? And I think that reimagining democracy needs to be smack bang on the table, because we're not going to be able to deal with the challenges that are required. And I think like 1966, or when London did its significant reforms of democracy, I think we're going to have to do something equivalent of the same order to build our capacity to make decisions. And I think that needs to be on the table, and I think politicians are scared to say this stuff, but it needs to be on the table. We are not responding fast enough or with greater relevance and shared consensus. Second, I think our transportation infrastructure is going to have to be reimagined. Electric vehicles are not the future, right? This is utterly not real. It's funded by car companies that are trying to replace petrol vehicles with motors. It is not real. If you look at the numbers behind electric vehicles in terms of the ecological damage, the future of London transportation is electric bikes. We need to replace half the roads with forests and make the other half of the roads entirely electric bike driven. So we need to be more sensitive about the system level costs and the system level capabilities and what the transitions look like, rather than just be driven by simplistic industry desires, which are non-viable at the scale that we're talking about. Electric bikes are amazing because they can keep the economic geography of London working at the scale that's required, whilst actually giving us the mobility pretty much at the same speed, if not faster, than what we've got. and releasing half the road space, which we're going to need for actually ecological development in terms of flood management and other risks. So we need to have a more integrated debate about what the future of infrastructure really looks like. I'll just pick two: mobility, ecological, and decision making. Those three are, I think, fundamental to making some of the transformations that are required. How do we have that debate? How do you get a transport engineer, citizens, and also ecological services to think together? We're going to have to be able to do this in a different way. And we need to be more honest. People are too scared to say stuff, which is what we're facing. And I think that's my biggest problem right now, is we're too scared to actually have honest debate. So we keep talking, shadowboxing each other.
Thank you. Elizabeth, can I ask you what you think local government should be doing differently, given all the changes that we see to support these future industries?
Yes, I was just thinking about what you were saying. I think we absolutely agree that you have to have a paradigm shift on how government across London works. And that I would say that's exactly what local government is doing at the moment. So to give you an example, which also touches on something else you just said, we now have this thing called Opportunity London, which is all London councils, the Mayor of London, businesses, who've come together to say, well, frankly, whatever flavour government comes in next, London is not going to be the recipients or sort of bagfuls of money to do anything with infrastructure. So we've come together, and for the first time we've produced a map of all the infrastructure projects we think we need over the next few years. Again, cross-party, cross-borough, with the mayor. And we're now sort of looking for, I'm so sorry, that's my phone. We are now looking to make sure, well, to look at how we finance it as well. So I think the consensus that you talked about absolutely exists. As I said before, I think we'll be putting out plans for what devolution we need, because again, with this infrastructure, we've got the money in London to do things, but so much of it doesn't stay in London. So I think one of the previous speakers, Paul, was saying that, business rates, whatever, in the West End all go to Wales or something. In my borough, we raise more business rates than Greater Manchester, but we don't keep very much of it, less than 20%. So if London could keep a bit more, we could do more things like the Elizabeth line and the Northern Line extension. So I think infrastructure is one thing that we really, really have to look at. And I'm not going to touch on electric bikes. I think probably for me, sort of mass transit is probably more important. That's probably enough for me now.
Yeah, thank you. So Tim, what can airports do to support London's future growth specifically?
There's probably three main areas I think that come to mind immediately. The first is to continue to provide connectivity so people can do business and attract inward investment and tourism, which is key to many sectors throughout London. And that will always be the case, I believe. We are in East London. We employ over 2,000 people currently. We have plans over the next 10 or so years to increase that by a further 1,300 people, contributing £1.5 billion to the economy. But we do need to adapt our operations, and we need to create new jobs, not just the traditional type of jobs you'd have at an airport. So, for example, related to our net zero ambitions and some of the zero emissions flight work we're doing, looking potentially at the Thames Estuary as an opportunity area for the likes of hydrogen research and development, act as catalyst in terms of incubation, living labs, that type of stuff that can then lead on to the manufacturing and end users in the Thames Estuary, and create a bit of an ecosystem in East London that not just benefits the aviation industry but benefits London economy in general. But the big challenge there is getting the policy framework in place, getting the market conditions in place, and that requires government, the GLA, everyone, business people need to think slightly differently as well. And it needs a lot more, I hate saying it's joined upness, if that's the right thing, to drive it, because infrastructure takes time to deliver. We all know that. It takes a long time. And unless the conditions are in place to incentivise and drive that change, then we're going to be left behind. And I think it's critical for London in particular to grasp those opportunities and drive it. And we as an airport can help, because potentially we're an end user, but also we have other ways of partnering up and sharing skills and potentially working with local universities to tailor curriculum such that the right type of candidates are coming forward for those new roles that are pretty much unprecedented. So that's another area we can help. And then lastly, I think just in terms of tourism, it is a big one. London is such a brilliant economy, but it's also a brilliant tourist destination. And there's ways in which it can continue to flourish and attract tourism, regardless of hybrid working and the town centre maybe not being as busy with bespoke working. But I mean, the tourism industry here, we're seeing it. We were traditionally a business airport, serving the likes of Canary Wharf when we first opened. That's shifted now. We're 50-50 leisure and business now. We are seeing more people travelling, even to East London as a destination now. And we can continue to help to promote that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Final thought from you, Alex, before I turn to the audience questions. We're getting lots of fantastic questions, so please continue sending them through. I'll come to those in just a moment. Alex, I just want to pick up this point that you made about what businesses say they're doing versus what they're actually doing. So in terms of what they're actually doing, are you seeing a shift in terms of businesses that are renting your properties?
Yeah, you could unpack a lot there, but we can correlate the contractual commitments that businesses make to us in taking space, and then look at actually in practice, post that period, whether people are actually even in the buildings. And it's great to issue surveys, it's great to sort of track behaviour, but there's nothing better than literally counting the people in your building and understanding if anyone's there. And we did that clearly a lot during COVID, especially because it was an important time to really get more granular understanding. But what that then has spun out is also an ability for us to look at what our built environment is doing from an energy consumption perspective at a much more careful level. And that's something that we're working and thinking about very carefully about how our customer base can align with what our overall aims are from a net zero perspective. And energy consumption is a really important one, and it's a struggle in so much as availability of data is poor and low. But we are trying to bring that discipline back to the portfolio, which retrofit was talked about earlier, and I think it's a really interesting point if I can spin onto that very briefly. But a lot of our buildings are heritage and wonderful, and for that very reason, extremely attractive for people to be in and around and surrounding, but clearly very difficult to tackle. And the customer, or many of our customers are large international organisations who've made bold statements around when their date is, as it were. But very few have been as forthcoming as we perhaps would have liked when it comes to actually doing something about it in their own building, in their own, where their own staff are, where their own leadership perhaps are occupying space. And that's a challenging conversation, one that I echo. We cannot dictate to them how to go about living their day, but we have to bring them along with us. And the retrofit question, I think, is really important because I think a lot of our industry, the construction and real estate industry, has been looking for a silver bullet to say this is how we're going to fix net zero in the built environment, as if it was that straightforward. And what I do think we need is a tone of discussion which is more permissive and welcoming iterative approaches. I think a lot of developers are afraid. A lot of developers have a very different business model to the Crown Estate, clearly, but a lot are concerned about the liquidity of their asset if they come forward and say, we tried this, but we didn't get as far as we hoped. We had great intentions, and we shot for the moon, and we didn't really get out of orbit. And that's a really hard thing for our industry to reckon with, and it's something I hope that the Crown Estate, we can be bold and confident and say, we've tried, and we've pushed, and we've opened the door and left it ajar for others to follow. And I feel that's probably one of our key contributions.
Yeah, really nice point. Just quickly picking up. So are there any major shifts in industries? Are you seeing?
In terms of coming to London? And
yeah.
We are, the most significant has been predominantly North American private equity businesses doubling down on their homes in London, and that's been a really interesting counter-narrative that I'm not trying to extrapolate into anything political, but there have been enormous commitments to buildings. Blackstone have taken probably the single largest headquarters in the core of the West End, which has been a bit of a paradigm shift for us, really, generally thinking that buildings in the West End had to be small because occupiers were relatively small in their headcount, and big businesses went to the city. And that has been an interesting shift. Not all city occupiers will come to the West End. There's an economic difficulty there, but our physical response to that is to have to work out how do we progressively and sustainably develop or create large footprint business or buildings to accommodate that demand, because it's not going away apparently.
Fascinating. Thank you. We've got it's just about 10 minutes. Lots of great questions, but please keep them coming in. And for those of you who are joining us online, use the hashtag #LondonNext and join the conversation. So this question has come in from Jim. Can we show a stronger commitment to engaging young people in conversations about London's future economy so they have the opportunity to shape it? Indy.
Yes.
I think it's the how.
So I think the reality is our democratic systems currently favour the present, right? They don't include future generations. We don't take account of actually systemically our generation collectively is murdering the opportunities of future generations, right? That's the truth of where we are. And that's a function of how we've organized our democracy, which doesn't represent future generations. It doesn't represent non-human systems, if you want to be a bit bolder and wilder here. So I do think a more systemic approach to our democratic reforms has to be on the table. And we do need greater participation into that story. And and my criticism is not a criticism of politicians presently. My criticism is not it's about saying where we need to go. Right? I recognize where we are. I recognize the difficulty politicians face day to day. But I do think we need to be more bolder about the deeper transformation of our society as a whole and making that participation. And I think if we can have the conversation, we can engage. So I do think we have to expand our enfranchisement, not just to present communities, not just to young people, but represent the needs of future generations, which are not on the table and which are massively being impacted. And we have to talk about other things beyond that as well. So,
thank you. Thank you.
Don't the parents of future generations have a vested interest?
Yes, but the parents of future generations are only very limited, right? So I had this conversation. So, well, this is a very long conversation I could get into.
I don't think we have time. I want to get through as many questions as we can. That does sound fascinating. We do have a break after this, so maybe those of you who want to hear that conversation, go find them over coffee. The next question that's come in is the U.S. digital economy alone contributes $2.4 trillion to American GDP. The entire GDP of the UK is $3.1 trillion. What needs to be done for data and digital sector growth? Elizabeth. Easy question there.
Wow.
Now we want to go back to that conversation.
Yeah, funny enough, I wanted to go back to that conversation. I'm probably better able to answer it. What do we need for digital growth? I suspect we want to do something that we've always done. You've got to make London a low regulatory economy. You've got to be a place where people actually want to come and base their businesses. You know, why London rather than Paris or Berlin? You've got to have housing in London so that people can actually afford to live here, especially the young. You know, when you look at the private rental sector, private rents have gone up 17% over the last year. There are 7 people applying for every 1 property in London. You've got to be able to have people to be able to come and go. And you've got to have the right skills as well. You know, we need to have people who've got the right skills. And again, I think that comes down to devolution, because with councils, we're quite good at getting people to into employment, but we're really sort of hammered by the government not even telling us who's on, not giving us the data or who in our area is coming out and ready for employment. So I think there's a whole thing around that too. Employment and skills, housing, we need more housing, and we need London just to be an attractive place for people to come.
Yeah. I love the Slido system because you can actually see how many great questions there are. So I'm actually going to take the chair's prerogative and get through these, if I may. I know, Indy, you wanted to come in. And actually, the next question I'm going to pose to you, which is around teachers. Now, you may change your mind about wanting to come in, which is, if we recognize teaching as the highest value job, how do we get to a point where we pay and resource our teachers appropriately before the sector collapses?
Yeah, two things. I wanted to say building a trusted data infrastructure is probably going to be one of the key assets that the UK has. So the quality and the integrity of data is going to be one of the valuable resources. And UK, the health service, and like what we did with open banking was a really powerful move, what we did.
Yeah.
We now need to do that with pretty much sector after sector, building the data infrastructure in that way and building a trusted data infrastructure just to build just to build that.
No. And I'm going to tag on. We also need power. Data centers use a lot of power, so we need to work up planning. We need digital infrastructure, and we need upskilling of people. It's the entire ecosystem that makes, Virginia is the world's biggest data center. Why? Because they have the ecosystem.
Exactly.
Slough Trading Estate is Europe's biggest data center. Why? Because there's power and there's support. And I think that's I'm eating up time. Can we get to teachers?
With teachers, look, I think there's a more systemic question here. We're going to see a fundamental shift in the human capital economy. And we need to recognize it's a fundamental shift as much as it was in the 70s, where we saw the breaking of an old economy and the making of a new economy. And that is going to require systemic investment in our educational platform as a whole. Like polytechnics we have to reimagine craft-based learning. The future of learning is going to be craft-based learning. Not crafts, but craft-based learning. The future sort of Cambridges and Oxfords will be of that order. And we need to reinvent our polytechnic infrastructure, not just for plumbing, but for data and AI and everything else. We've got to reimagine it in a craft-based learning framework. That requires reinvestment in our educational infrastructures all the way through, from nursery onwards. And I think I would hope any next government comes in with a radical reform program of our educational platform as a whole and valuing teachers significantly higher by pulling in that capital. We are going to have to invest in our human capital transformation if London's going to be relevant.
Great, thank you. Such great questions. The next one is honest debates need also to support those on low income, protected groups, build equity and equality. Not all Londoners have equal access to these conversations. Does anyone just want to comment on that? It's more of it is an inclusion point, which is really very important. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that, because we've seen with the whole levelling up agenda so much money being diverted from London or not given to London. And again, what Paul was saying, we've got to think about it in terms of people rather than of regions. And London has some of the poorest, most challenging areas in the country. And you take my borough, you think Kensington, Chelsea, oh wow, all incredibly rich, but actually we've got 5 wards who rank amongst the poorest in the country. So any growth that comes has to be inclusive.
Okay, we only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to pose a question now around landlords to Alex. And just to warn you, Tim, I'm going to come to you on what a net zero airport even looks like. But Alex first, as responsible landlords, what social investment activities do you intend to implement to ensure your portfolios benefit the people that live there?
I think as an estate owner, it is less for us to sort of attempt to directly impact or simply direct activity. We can facilitate. And we can facilitate through a variety of means, but it's always indirect. And I think that's always perhaps a frustration when looked upon or regarded. Why aren't you doing more? I think one of the things we've tried to do is really open up our activity to our local community. So we predominantly work in Westminster, and in Westminster we've made a big push around trying to drive employment opportunities on portfolio through our customer base to the local residents. And I think that's something which we are now growing and rolling out around the country across our regional portfolio. And I think that's about having an open door policy to opportunity with our activity rather than specifically pushing.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tim, what does a net zero airport even look like? Recent Guardian report says that 90% of carbon capture doesn't work and the final 10% is uncertain.
So for us, we have very clear plans between now and 2030, and that's to achieve net zero for our own operations. A lot of the investment there will be in our buildings, on the ground. In terms of our existing retrofitting, moving away from gas-fired CHP towards air source heat pumps, for example, which is a significant investment in itself, looking at opportunities on district heating, etc., ensuring that our fleet is zero emissions or low emissions as well. and working with industry and partners to help them achieve their targets for aircraft in flight, which is an obvious one as well. But again, it's not just us; it's the entire industry. It's education, it's government policy, it's all those aligning, working together to achieve net zero. And what it looks like beyond that will be, I suppose, the result of the efforts we put in now, and not in 10 or 15 years' time. Now is the time to be planning for that and looking to try and incubate that kind of change that's needed to help us all achieve a successful economy, whilst also allowing for air travel going forward.
Fantastic. We are actually out of time, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question. The question is, would Indy consider running for mayor? I'm going to suggest a joint ticket with Elizabeth as well. I think you all will agree they certainly earned their applause that you gave them before they came to the stage. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Thank you so much, Linda, and the panelists. What a great conversation. Quite a lot to talk about during the break, including, I think, forestation. Indy will be running on an electric bike exclusively platform for London Mayor, which, given the difficulties of the ULEZ, I think will be an intriguing challenge. And I also wanted to pick up on something Elizabeth said earlier, which I think is sort of the elephant in the room in much of this conversation, although acknowledged, which is that we're a hugely centralised economy, but Elizabeth and colleagues cross-party and cross-sector are working to make the case for decentralisation, devolution to government. And I think that's something that all of us in the room could pick up on in conversations during the break as well, because I think it's going to be a bit of a theme running through all the conversations today. But with no further ado, you have earned a break. Outside there are refreshments and there's toilets on the second floor and in the basement. And if you could all come back and take your seats promptly by 11:40, that would be wonderful. Thank you all.
Centre for London.
1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
Hi, all welcome back. For those standing at the back, do come forward and take your seats. We won't all stare at you unless you like that. No? Oh, a hushed silence. I like it. I hope you all had some nice discussions and some average coffee out there. It's fine. It's fine. I've had worse. Welcome back to the second half of the conference. We've got two fantastic panel discussions, I'm sure, coming up. So I would like to invite to the stage Claire Harding, Research Director at Centre for London. She's going to make a short presentation and then a panel discussion will follow. And I should also remind you to keep asking your questions through Slido, and that goes for you, anyone watching online as well. As we go through the next conversations, and I'll try and allow lots of time at the very end of the conference to take any final questions from our last panel. Thank you. Claire.
Thank you. I'm here with an absolutely brilliant panel and the quite significant challenge of talking to you all about fairness, which is a very large topic and we're not going to get through it in 40 minutes. But it was really striking to me, and I'm sure to many of you, that in our last set of questions about what the next economy looked like, we were kind of already moving on in the Slido to these questions about fairness and what does a fair future look like. It feels like now is such a good and important time to be talking about what we mean by fairness and how fairness intersects with the two other things we're talking about today, which are things we also need, jobs and economy and a rapid move to net zero. So I'm really glad that this session is here at this point in the day to kind of integrate all of those things together. I've got an absolutely brilliant panel coming up, so I'm not going to bore you with lots of slides. Those of you who know me know that I absolutely love talking about data, and if I was allowed, I would talk about it for the whole session. But just to frame our discussion today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the polling work that we do with our friends at Savanta, where we talk to a whole bunch of Londoners about what matters to them. And as you can imagine, in that very rich data set, there's a huge amount that we could talk about London's and Londoners' experience of what it is to be in a fair city. I'm just going to highlight two which really struck me. The first is that only 36% of Londoners, last time we asked, which was January, said that they trusted the police to treat everybody fairly regardless of who they were. That is a hell of a challenge when it comes to having a city that works for everybody if people don't trust one of our most major institutions to treat everybody fairly. And then alongside that, we of course have some of the worst financial unfairness that probably we've seen certainly in my lifetime, and every time we get the results in from our survey of Londoners survey, we think, oh God, surely it cannot get any worse, and then it proceeds to get worse. So just one thing that struck me that came out of this, because I imagine I'm not the only person in the room who has had the fairly appalling experience of discovering that your washing machine is pouring water all over your kitchen floor, and you have a young child, and the washing machine currently contains all the trousers that you've been using for potty training. Anyone else had that? That was a particular low, in almost as bad as when the kettle broke down at the time that I was using lots of formula milk. Particular low in my parenting experience. And sort of on the basis of the commonness of these sorts of experiences, we ask people whether or not they could meet an unexpected expense of about £500. That is about the cost of a washing machine. And the answer is that a quarter of men and a third of women say they cannot. And I think what that speaks to is not just that people are living on very low incomes, we know that, but also that the challenge that people are living in such challenging circumstances that reacting to the sort of change, both personal, my washing machine, and societal, as we were talking about in the last session, becomes really, really challenging. And I think that's one of the biggest and most fundamental issues we have to face, is that fairness is about resilience, and resilience is how we react to change. It's about how we react to change, and how we react to change is about how we build a new city. So with that challenging background from my panellists, I'm going to introduce them all and invite them to take seats. I'm going to sit there, so in the other four seats. So we have Pauline Danion, who's on the wrong page of my notes, who's the Director of Engagement at London Youth, Councillor Georgia Gold, the Leader of the Council at the London Borough of Camden, Alex Jan, the Chair of the Central District Alliance, among his many hats, and Sam Gurney, the London Regional Secretary at the TUC. So I hope you agree, absolutely brilliant panel, so I shall invite you to do what Linda did and applaud them as they come up, and then if you like what they say, you can applaud them as they come down as well. Thank you. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I think, as I've said, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I know that some of our panellists have been looking forward to it for a long time. Some of them are just back from holiday. Some of us are going on holiday. So I'm going to start by asking all of you what you think we mean by fairness in the context that we're in now. And what does fair look like at this time of very rapid change and further change to come? And I'm going to ask you in the order in which you are seated. So Pauline first, if I may.
Okay, no, thank you for that. It's an interesting question. What does fairness look like? I suppose the starting point would be that it's probably coming from an equity perspective. Fairness in terms of equal access to all services, having equal access to employment opportunities. Fairness means if you're a young person born in the capital, that you can grow up knowing that the properties you see, the jobs you see, the lifestyle you see, that you've got an equal and a fair chance of accessing that. And so regardless of who you are, where you come from, regardless which borough you come from, London is yours and you can have equal access to London. And it isn't something that is inaccessible and out of your reach, but all young people are born and they're growing up and they're confident that they can actually access and enjoy and have the benefits of the capital. For me, that's what fairness would look like.
Thank you very much. Georgia?
Absolutely agree with what Pauline said. And I think for me, it's that people have access to what they need to live, and we're increasingly seeing that people don't. And in London, that is particularly stark, I think, because of the cost of housing. So we now have over 160,000 people, over 85,000 children who are living in temporary accommodation, sometimes a B&B, don't know where they're going to sleep the next night. And it's 1 in 23 kids, so 1 in every classroom. Just enormous numbers, and that kind of instability is deeply unfair. And we have a city where housing is just not accessible, stable, secure, safe housing where a child might be able to have a room to do homework. It's just not accessible to so many of our residents. But we also have an economy where many people are working and still in deep poverty. So in London, it's 50% of those who are in poverty have at least one member of a household who's in a working family. So, going to work every day, as you know, the myth, if you go to work and you play by the rules, then you should have what you need, and still having to use a food bank, having to skip meals so your children can eat. And that is really widespread. It's widespread in the public sector and it's widespread in the private sector. So I'd like, for me, a fairer city would be one that people had access to food, access to housing, access to childcare, access to good quality paid employment, to the basics that they need to live, but also to some of the opportunities and joys that a creative place like London has to offer.
Thank you. Georgia. Sam?
How to add to that, I mean, clearly would agree with all of those points. In terms of the kind of economic fairness, the fact that we've had obviously falling real pay for the last 10 years, over the last 10 years in a situation where pay in London was already very low for huge numbers of our people. And that point around the fact, majority of kids living in poverty in London at the moment are in working households. People are working 1, 2, 3 jobs, but it's not paying. And so we've had that huge issue. And then in terms of fairness, the disproportionate impact of that, if we look at black Londoners, if we look at women, much kind of like greater or much very disproportionately represented in insecure jobs. So 0 hours jobs in London, we have the highest number of 0 hours jobs anywhere in the country, highest number of people on short-term hours, I said, and very low pay, and across huge sectors of our economy. So whilst that last session was rightly looking at where future jobs are going to come from, actually, if you look at the sectors in London which employ huge numbers of people at the moment, social care, hundreds of thousands, hospitality, hundreds of thousands of our fellow Londoners, these are areas that have had systematically poor business models for a long time, and how we get that moving, how we get fairness into the system there. We'll come on to some of the answers to that in a minute, but I think that we have a very unbalanced economy in London, and we need to start addressing that to get to economic fairness.
Thank you. Alex, are you going to agree with everything said so far?
Up to a point. I think I'd extend the concept of fairness to something that was highlighted by Elizabeth in the previous panel, and is this theme that Gemma talked about in terms of the devolution agenda. And I think that's important because I think the reality is that London is, as we always say at these events, it's this big motor generating public finances or public tax fiscal surpluses which are then spent by central government. But I think an aspect of fairness would be to retain more of that, or a bit more of that public sector tax base as we grow, hopefully, to spend on the people who live here. Because although London is full of opportunity and has historically provided people with a place where they can get on, where they feel more able to be themselves and so forth, it's also a place with higher levels of what economists call, negative externalities, i.e. problems. And those problems surround our businesses, our residents, the boroughs every day. So I think an aspect of fairness is also that the boroughs, City Hall and others get a fair share of the resources they need in order to help to make London livable, safe and attractive for all of its people, including its residents. And the chances are, if they had more power over how they spent the money that they do have, they'd spend it on things like further education, which is the Cinderella service, something that we know about in our area. Debbie Akehurst, our chief exec, we've been doing stuff on digital and hospitality, academies with Kingsway Community College and others. And then the other final thing, Claire, on fairness is something which does worry me, which is the extent to which relatively small numbers of people, individuals, perhaps get in the way of decisions which would benefit more people who live here. And I guess I'm talking about the planning system and the need to build more houses in particular.
Thank you very much. You very elegantly moved me on to what I was going to propose as our next topic of conversation, which is about fairness and power. So I'm going to invite thoughts next, both on what Alex has just been saying to us about devolution and how devolution could be used to make London a fairer city, but also one of the questions that came up in our last session about the involvement of young people in decision-making processes. So perhaps first to Georgia for further reflections on devolution, and then to Pauline to talk about young people.
Yeah, I think that kind of one of the great myths that in the kind of national debate is this idea that I think that's been debunked by the panel, that London is a place full of resources and huge growth and productivity, which compared to much of the country is true, but that the existence of that is changing and benefiting the lives of our residents. And actually, too often we're not able to capture the value that's created in our communities. And a young person, living in Somerstown, which is very close to King's Cross, and all the growth that's happening there, can feel so deeply alienated by watching kind of wealth being created, watching their community change, feeling like they will no longer be able to afford to live in a place. And we have some levers to address that, but we don't have the levers we need. So I think that we're the most centralised country in Europe, and that means that decisions are made really far away from communities, which hurts London and it hurts the rest of the country. So I think we need to see a kind of seismic shift of power down to regions and councils. And I think we could address policy by doing that so much better. So to just give one example, which is the kind of job centre and employment experience, and what residents talk about what it feels like to go into a job centre, and they find that experience often deeply dehumanising. That it's about sanctions, it's not about who them as a person and their aspirations. And many of us as councils have started to set up kind of alternative employment services that are community based, that work alongside people, that look at what they need to thrive, whether that's childcare or access to a laptop or further education training, and to support them on that journey. But we're doing that we're kind of a double cost, because we're funding that locally, whereas if you just kind of devolved that whole budget down to councils, I think we would both be able to support people better, but also look at how we have the kind of powers to make our businesses people ready, more inclusive, more able to provide flexible working hours, living wage, the kind of things that we know make them better places to work. So, and I think the same applies to kind of every aspect of policy, housing, and so on. So, I think that the case for devolution for me sits hand in hand with fairness, but also you mentioned power, and for one of the reasons I think devolution is so important is it allows people to have much more direct power over the decisions that impact them. And when we run locally citizens' assemblies, or we're working with the Institute for Global Prosperity on a Wellbeing Index, the insight from citizens about what it actually means to have inclusive growth for them. And they will talk about things like social connectedness, like the culture and heritage of their community, things that we might not come up with, in terms of policy goals. And to do that in tandem and allow that true community leadership, I think needs devolution and needs a real sharing of power. You can't have town halls that act like central government. They have to completely differently work with our communities.
Thank you very much. Lots in there. I hope we'll manage to get to certain aspects of it through the rest of our discussion. But Pauline, to come to you, we sort of all seem to agree that we need to have change. We need to involve people, young people in particular, in this change because they're the ones who are going to have to live with it. What's the best way? How do you make it actually work?
I don't even think it's that complicated. And, just looking out at the audience today, a really rich mix of people, yet very little representation from the youth sector in terms of young people. And I don't know if it's a very UK thing. I don't know what it is, but we have this way of making decisions, planning the future without the input of young people's views and perspectives on that. And if you've ever had the pleasure of sitting with young people to talk about real important issues facing the capital, facing the future, you'll find they'll come up with some really innovative solutions. And I'm using the word innovative, but in effect, I think as we get older, this was just something I was saying before, I don't know if we stop asking the difficult questions or we almost go to what we think the answer is likely to be. We kind of skip over the hurdles. Young people don't do that. They'll just come straight to the crux of what the problem is. And so because of that, we've got to have a diversity of views whenever we're having any discussion, any debates about the capital, about the future, when we're talking about the economy, when we're talking about jobs, whatever the topic is, you will get a different perspective and a different mix in the solution when you have a younger perspective and view. They're not as tarnished as we are with life. And so they bring a different element of optimism. We don't even realize we're skipping over it. We're dodging the difficult things and we're going straight to what an easy solution might be. They're not doing that because, we as adults, we're almost like planning the future for them when we're talking about the future economy, the future jobs. But they are the ones that are going to inherit that future jobs. They are the ones that are going to be the leaders of this great city, with all the challenges that London brings, of all the inequality in the capital. A recent survey by the Partnership for Young London, it surveyed over 1,000 young people, and where young people are really saying, they want to stay in the capital. Over half of them want to stay and live in London, but only 1 in 4 actually believe it's going to be possible. So it's looking a little bit bleak for them because they don't really know how. When you look at the housing crisis, and if you kind of look up the scale a little bit to those who first jobs and if they have to leave home, when we think of young people, it's a real mix as well. You've got young people coming from a stable home who've got the support of mum and dad, but you've also got young people who are care leavers who have to then, at 16, 17, they are, gently or not so gently tipped out into the world to make their way in life. Have to find accommodation, have to find jobs. They don't have the same support network around them. We've got disabled young people as well that have other challenges as well. And so as a society, how invested are we in ensuring that all of our young people can really access the opportunities that exist in the capital? And are we really aware of the challenges that they're facing when we're talking about the jobs? How are they being prepared in terms of the skills and the skills development? What are they going to find interesting, appealing, and some of the solutions that they will come up with? Because with all things in terms of just innovation, and it was interesting, the discussion in the earlier meeting in terms of reimagining democracy. That's a really lovely topic for another day. I'd love to kind of get into that one. But it's almost like, I often think of it in a telephone. When we think of the evolution of telephones, you kind of waited for the infrastructure to be put in place, and then you get your landline, and then, mobile came, and then you wait for the connection. And then in other areas, if you kind of look in other countries, solar energy. And straight away, there was no infrastructure, there was no telephone, it jumped straight to solar-powered mobiles. Young people they're jumping, where they're thinking, oh, no, you can't go there, you've got to wait for the next step. That's not really what's happening for them. So I think we've just got to be more generous as adults, policymakers, decision makers, to include a diversity of views around the table, to ensure that we're not making decisions on behalf of somebody else with our limited understanding. We were all going to say we were young once. I've stopped saying that because my experience as a young person is very different to the experiences of a young person now. So we've got to ensure that their voices are represented and heard around the table when decisions are being made.
Thank you so much. I saw lots of nods going on in the audience there, but both from some of our youth sector people and from some of our childcare sector people. It starts really young. I'm going to come on now to some of the challenges that we face sort of in the transition that we're in at the moment, in this moment that we're in now. So sort of going from that big picture back down to maybe a slightly smaller picture, because it's been a complicated first quarter to the year, I think, for London. So I'm going to come to Alex and to Sam to talk a bit about some of those specific challenges. Alex, I know that we're in a moment of flux, aren't we, when it comes to whether people are in the office or working from home, or what that balance looks like, recognising, of course, that for many, many Londoners, working from home has never been an option. And for some Londoners, working from home has actually been a very established way of working for a very long time. But as businesses are starting to think about what their new normal looks like in a kind of post-pandemic world, how do we balance the desire of businesses to get people into central London in particular with the equality benefits of greater flexibility?
Well, I think, again, we could have a whole conference on this subject with me being the speaker, actually, if we wanted it. It's such a rich subject. I think the whole question of fairness and working at home is a complicated one, because, you know, it's clear that to a certain extent it has given people flexibility to do things in a different way. But the thing I would emphasize is that this has really picked up and accelerated and changed because of COVID. And as we know, COVID was a public health crisis. And so the decisions to encourage people to work differently was not driven by some sort of economic theory or rationale. It was driven by a public health crisis. And we've come out of that crisis, thank goodness. And now it's kind of seen, particularly government level, interestingly, that it's kind of all right for us to perpetuate this model. And I don't think we've really thought through the long-term consequences of that. And in fact, the story before COVID was that actually thriving city centres, which were places of work, high levels of density, supported by public transport, were a good thing. And this comes to the heart of some of the concerns we have around the panel, because those are the areas that produce higher paid jobs for people and also provide people with more opportunity. And a lot of that opportunity is happenstance. It comes through serendipity. And if we're talking about particularly young people's life chances and opportunities, I do think that we need to think carefully as employers and government about what we're potentially doing to their opportunities to get on in work, to be in better paid jobs, to live more interesting professional lives as such, as part of that equation. And I don't think we've got the balance quite right there. And, you know, this is all tangled up in housing. I mean, there's some work by the Resolution Foundation, other think tanks are available, which show that 16% of Londoners are living in substandard housing, which is twice the number of people in Northern Ireland or Scotland who suffer the same fate. So if we're going to have a discussion about housing and work and the office and fairness and opportunity, I think we should also be very much alive to the fact that there is a real challenge there in terms of the experience that a lot of people have working from home, which is very different from some of the others of us who are perhaps more lucky with the setups that we have.
Thank you very much. And Alex has just given me an excellent opportunity to tell you that we're doing a lot of work on housing at Centre for London this year, and really looking forward to working with a lot of people in this room and beyond on how do we ask the really big and difficult questions about what the future of housing looks like in London. But for now, back to another big and difficult question, which perhaps an elephant in the room. Many of us, I think, at the moment being impacted by strikes. Many of our loved ones have been on strike. It's perhaps certainly the most complex time for industrial relations that I can remember. So I'd like to ask Sam, how at the TUC you reconcile public sector workers' push for fair pay for themselves with the impact of strikes on vulnerable Londoners, many of whom we know are being paid significantly less than what people who are striking are on.
I'd take slight issue with that point, because actually what we're seeing is Londoners across the economic spectrum taking action, and that's Londoners in private and public sectors. So I think what you really have to look at is why people are being pushed to this stage, and this comes to a fundamental point you'd expect me to make around how we make the London economy fairer, which is the best way to get a sustainable, fairer economy is for people to be able to organise themselves, protect their own terms and conditions, advance them as far as is possible within the businesses they work in. And actually, when you talk to colleagues, as you would expect I do, on lots and lots of picket lines across lots of sectors, people are taking action both in defence of their immediate pay, salary, terms and conditions, but also for the services they're working in. So when you talk to transport workers, this comes to the point around kind of people who are actually kind of, the best place to talk about the things which they're in. You talk to transport workers around what they're trying to do to protect the service which we have in London, be that bus drivers, be that TfL workers on the tube. You talk to teachers who feel they've been pushed into taking action. No one wants to go on strike. It's always an absolute last resort. But they are talking about the fact that they are teaching in schools where they are having to run fundraising things just to get not extras, but the very most basic equipment that they need. You talk to health workers, paramedics kind of on the picket line, who are there with their ambulances ready to go if there's an absolute kind of emergency about what's been happening to their service. And it's heartbreaking. I think George made this point around talking to workers in London who are making that choice about whether they have breakfast or they give their kids breakfast. And I'm talking to those people on taking action kind of every day, talking to supermarket workers. So these are workers selling us our food who are making the call about whether to eat breakfast themselves or give their kids breakfast before they go to school. This is 21st century Britain and London. And so, those people are taking action in their defence, and the best way to actually solve that is to get some movement and get things running. There's all sorts of ways we can get money into the system to make sure people get fair pay. I can come back to things like the Good Work Standard, like the London Living Wage campaign, but actually unionisation and getting people to be able to protect their own terms and conditions is the primary way we're going to get a fairer city, and that we're seeing that at the moment from people taking action.
Thank you, and in fact, thank you to my panel for answering some difficult questions. We've got some more difficult ones coming up on Slido, which is open to you all now. It'll be up on the screen in just a second, and it's on my iPad. So just a reminder to please do submit your questions, whether you're joining us online or in the room. But our first one, I think, is actually quite an optimistic one, and I'll open it up to everybody on our panel, which is, where in the world would you point to as an aspirational example of a fair economy, and who's tackling this well? And I will take international, domestic, London examples. Please.
Should we go first? So if we look at this, comes back to some of the points that Alex was making on flexibility and how we get the most out of that. So we will often, as a trade union movement, look at our colleagues in Scandinavian countries and look at countries which have done far better in terms of pay disparity, in terms of balance on issues around childcare, etc. And where you look at changes, we had that bit of discussion on kind of AI and stuff earlier on, and how workplaces are changing with kind of fourth industrial revolution and tech changes, but looking at countries where they actually involve their workforces in that change, be it just transition, be it technological change kind of linked to that, where you've got an inbuilt policy. It comes back to points that Paulie was making about who's in the room when these decisions are made, but an inbuilt kind of thing where you've got employers, unions and other stakeholders sitting down together to actually look at the changes which are coming, short, medium and long term, and look at how you react to that. And if we had time, I could give you some fantastic examples from Norway and Sweden, but how they've done some of that. If you look at a kind of more local level, we have boroughs in London who've been doing some really good work. George was saying around kind of work they've been doing in Camden on looking at inequality within their boroughs, and again bringing the right people around the table. Newham, Islington, Enfield, all have had kind of Southwark, lots of kind of really good, sorry to other councils in the room, but initiatives where they pulled people into the room and said, what could we do at a local level? And that comes back a bit to the devolution point, which I didn't get a chance to answer earlier, but I would quite like, if we've got time, to come back to that devolution point, but I'll let other colleagues come in first on that.
Thank you very much. Always comes back to power. Who'd like to go next on this one? Alex?
Okay, so I think the reality is that there is no one place. I mean, particularly if we're talking about this in a city's context, I think in some ways there are things that we could pick and choose from other cities. So the New Yorks of this world have much greater fiscal devolution. They have a property tax base, which cuts both ways because it goes up and, as we're finding out, goes down. But they have greater power, autonomy, and fiscal power to get things done. So we probably like a bit of that. I think some other cities are cleaner, particularly in their central areas. They don't have phone boxes everywhere, which is just talking about phone boxes. You know, not only have we leapt to the mobile phone, we've somehow managed to cling on to phone boxes in central London, which I know Camden is working relentlessly to get rid of and shouldn't have to. End of speech. And in some ways, the answer to this question for me is what could you do? Because in some ways, London is the most remarkable city. It has so many strengths. It's right that we fret and are concerned about issues that we're talking about today. But in some ways, a slightly adjusted London model where, you know, we had the sort of powerful local government institutions we had in the Victorian period, combined with being part, dare I say it, of a single market which allows for proper free movement and trade with the rest of Europe, which I know is something the mayor has, I think, very rightly gone out and advocated. I think those are the sorts of things we could do to make London fairer, and it doesn't require a lift and shift from another country. I mean, the comparisons with Scandinavia and other places are fine up to a point, but they tend to be with very small cities, with very big states, very rich countries, and which are culturally very homogeneous. And London is not many of those things. So when we try and answer this question, we have to reflect the scale, the complexity, and of course the strengths of London. So pick and choose, but let's make London a bit more like it was in the past in order to make it better in the future.
Thank you. Georgia?
Yeah, a general point is I think that you pretty much look most places in Europe and you will see far greater devolution as a kind of country system than we have in the UK. And I think that, you know, part of our issues that we have long term around productivity are linked to centralisation. But I think we're not in cities waiting for government to shift their position. I think we're focused on what leadership we can take within the current system. And to do that, I think as London, we are looking to other pioneering cities. So we've been working with Mariana Mazzucato on a missions-based approach, learned a huge amount from Stockholm and the approach they took to childhood hunger, and using that as a mission that galvanized action on the whole supply chains, on environmental action as well as hunger. And we've been taking a missions-based approach both in Camden and in London across the city. We've been working with Demos Helsinki on the approach they're taking to really transforming institutions. We had a session recently with Amsterdam, who've been taking on Kate's ideas around donut economics and how we bring that thinking into London. Paris, I think, are doing really pioneering work around a standing citizens' assembly and how they bring citizens into decision making. So I think as a city, we need to be kind of looking at the innovation that's out there, but also thinking about the resources that we do have. You know, we are really powerful as councils, as public sector institutions, as private sectors in terms of our procurement, our spending power, our ability to really transform lives within the kind of context and powers that we already have. And as you've said, I think there are really good examples in different boroughs, and I think the work we're trying to do around London is to bring that together. So we are really using the energy, creativity and ideas of Londoners to solve the massively complex challenges we have.
Just very briefly, I think the thing that I would add, just not even looking internationally, but just the challenges being faced by even local authorities with cuts in budgets. But those that take a bold decision to still keep the investment in young people and in youth services, I think they're the ones that are really saying that, yeah, we're going to keep that at the forefront. Because it's a difficult choice when you've got reduced budgets and where do you put the spend, but to still make that commitment to invest in young people, to invest in youth services, you know, so being able to look to see how they've managed to make that work, I think those are important examples that we can reflect on.
Thank you very much. Lots of really inspiring and challenging stuff there. I feel like we could have several conferences just devoted to the question of whether or not we should aspire to be Scandinavia. But coming on to our next question, we have what does a 21st century outstanding school look like through the lenses of citizenship, attainment and employment? And I'm going to invite the panel not to take this as being a question about Ofsted, because I think there are many and good questions about Ofsted and now is not the time to address them, but instead to answer fairly briefly, if you would, on what would outstanding look like in terms of the education that we provided for young children, for our children and young people, rather than in terms of what do we mean by an Ofsted outstanding grade.
I'll have a go at this one.
Thank you.
Just bringing a bit of a wider perspective in terms of just some of the work I've done over the years, looking at education as well as youth services. I think an education system that it's much more inclusive, and inclusive also in terms of the way that your education is taught and different pathways to teaching young people. Here in the UK, we're a little bit hung up on one single way of doing things in terms of learning by rote and then repeating it at the end in terms of exams. But having a wider breadth of teaching styles, project-based learning, understanding that children are learning in different ways. There are different barriers that some children, young people have, but not to kind of look down on it in any way, because ultimately we're looking for the outcome that the young person has, that they've gone through an education system and they're coming out with a suite of skills, they're coming out with a confidence to be able to enter the world of work, not just with, 8 GCSEs and, 2 or 3 A levels and a degree. All really important, but there are different pathways that young people can take to obtaining their academic credentials and making better use of the apprenticeship routes as well. So I think there's a whole range of different pathways and ways of teaching that can actually be beneficial to all young people. And I think it's incumbent on schools to really make the most of those, but also I think as well, DfE and Department for Education to give that flexibility to enable schools to ensure that they can support a child through their learning so that they can come out resilient and ready to enter the world of work, but just to be responsible young people ready for society. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Sam to respond briefly and then I will put one last question each to Alex and Georgia.
Thanks. So just to kind of slightly expand this to the importance of lifelong learning and that thing around, this is the absolute critical importance of early years, and I think colleagues on the previous panel talked about that and colleagues here have talked about that, but, we know that investment in early years, I was talking to one of the kind of people who started some of the Sure Start stuff yesterday, but that, is absolutely critical to how our kids then kind of move up through the system. So getting the early years stuff right is critical to a fair London economy, making sure people can work, parents can kind of go out, but also our kids are getting a good education, making sure the funding is then in our primary and secondary schools and in London. That was one of our real success stories, was we actually did have greater investment and that was borne out kind of in results, but then that then feeds through into adult education, as was mentioned, into what is happening with our FE and adult education sector in London. Where are the opportunities for kind of ongoing skills development throughout people's lives? And again, just to quickly come back to the devolution point, that again is one of our success stories. We have a devolved adult education budget in London. We have large amounts of money still just going into that, and we've been able to do things like prioritise funding for people who are on London Living Wage or unemployed, to do level 2 and level 3 skills. We've been able to prioritise English as a second language training when other areas haven't had that. And I will stop there. But so how you get good schools, investment and keeping people in the system.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm so sorry, we could go on this all day, but I'm going to ask Georgia terribly briefly this question about do we need a London child poverty strategy, and then straight on to Alex on can London's economy truly be fair if the divide over home ownership for young people isn't addressed? In about 20 seconds each, please.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely need a strategy around poverty, and one of our missions in London that go through the London Partnership Board that's up there is around a safety net for all Londoners. So we are kind of coming together in partnership to try and address these issues across London. But we are always looking for more energy and ideas. So anyone who's in the room and wants to be part of that journey, please just get in touch.
Admirable, thank you, Alex.
So the short answer is I don't think it can be fair. I think that, we're probably building around only 40% of the homes that we need to be building every year. I think that there's some excellent work done by Centre for Cities, which showed that housing costs were a factor in London's productivity suffering. London's productivity fell from 3% of growth per worker per annum before 2007 to 0.2%. And housing is a factor in that equation, which affects not only those who are less well off in London already, but actually people on medium and slightly higher earnings who want to come to London and just can't afford it, along with the childcare costs and so forth. There's an opportunity here. Inner London's population is about a third lower than it was in 1939. So we've got an opportunity to put 1 million more people into inner London, which I think would broadly welcome the growth. And then all our friends in the outer London boroughs and the shires can turn over and go back to sleep, and we'll have their young people and the growth that goes with them. Thank you.
And that is where we end. I feel like this could go on all day. Thank you so much to our fantastic panel. Such an interesting conversation. Thank you to all of us who submitted questions. All that remains for me is to say we're still looking for a new chief executive. We were this morning and we still are. So please do come and talk to any one of us in the lunch break if you think that might be you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to all the panellists. We have one last session. That struck me that there's probably in that conversation another conference that we could work up, something around empowerment, democracy and devolution. There's a huge strength of feeling and lots to discuss on those topics. I'm now in the slightly awkward position of inviting myself to the stage because I'm going to be chairing the next panel, on the last panel of the morning, entitled Creating a Net Zero Economy in London. Before I take a seat, I'll invite my fellow panellists to the stage. So Kate Rayworth, Dimitri Zengelis and Mayor Roxana Fiaz, please join me up on the stage. Thank you. Oh, sorry. They're all fresh. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to come straight to you, Dimitri. Please do introduce yourselves in turn as I come to each of you as well. But I thought we might just start with a definition. We talk about net zero and we throw the phrase around like we all know what we're talking about and assuming we're all talking about the same thing. But Dimitri, perhaps you could just define for us a net zero economy.
Yeah, so a net zero economy is about getting the flow of emissions. So let's start at the beginning. Greenhouse gases, they sit around the atmosphere for tens, maybe hundreds of years, depending on the gas. It's the stock of greenhouse gases that affect the climate, not the flows, not the annual emissions. So one of the things people don't realize is we will transition to net zero. That's a given. Because unless you get the flows down to net zero, which is basically enough annual emissions that do not exceed the Earth's natural capacity to absorb them, then the stock of these greenhouse gases is just going to go up and up and up. And I can tell you one thing, we're not going to be living on a planet where the stock of greenhouse gases goes up and up and up and up. We're either going to manage that process and reduce emissions to net zero voluntarily, or we let nature do it for us by creating such a hostile climate that we depopulate and deindustrialize the planet. We don't want to do that. One way or another, we will get to net zero. The question is when and how. And as a minimum, we need to get to net zero by mid-century if we're to be in with a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, which is already a very risky place in terms of temperatures relative to pre-industrial times.
Thank you. That's a nice, simple explanation. Kate, if I may come to you next, so given Dimitri's definition, what are the implications, therefore, of that pressure on our economy?
I'm a little bit thrown because I thought I was going to be doing a presentation.
I'm so sorry.
We can do this instead.
I do not have that in my notes, but Kate, please give us. I'm so sorry.
We can do this instead.
Thank you for your honesty. No, please, Kate, give your presentation because I would hate to think that you've prepared one that we haven't.
Go on, let's just do this instead. Let's play. I have a real problem with net zero framing, actually. I'm worried that we reduce, it just makes everything so much easier. We just talk about this one thing, which is carbon emissions, and we've got to get it to zero, and then we talk about a year. I agree with what Dimitri just said, but I'm really concerned that we miss the massive paradigm change that we actually need to meet. That's why I brought my hosepipe with me. So we're stuck in the paradigm. We're stuck in the paradigm of growth endlessly. We're stuck in a paradigm that we've inherited from the 20th century, that the way you judge success of a nation, of a city, of the global economy is GDP, and it needs to increase year on year on year on year. And if you look, you don't have to even look very carefully, it goes through the ceiling. It just makes no sense. So growth is a wonderful, healthy phase of life. We love to see our kids grow. It's spring. We all love to see the plants grow. Growth tells us things are alive, and that's why we love it, and we deeply feel it as human beings. But nothing in nature grows forever. Our kids grow up. I have 14-year-old twins. They're taller than me. And now, thank goodness, they're going to stop growing, because if they keep on growing, they will literally never belong in my household anymore. The trees outside are growing, but they will grow. Oak tree takes 300 years to grow, 300 years to mature, 300 years to die. But we have created economies, especially through the 20th century, especially with the injection of fossil fuels at the beginning of that made us think that a growing economy is normal. And it came to seem normal, and we've written growth into all of our institutions, into the way we pay our pensions, into the very language of what we think success looks like. So we're deeply addicted and stuck in this. And then along comes the need to reduce carbon emissions, and so we pocket it into a little phrase and call it net zero. So I'm sort of rebelling against the fact that I'm in a panel discussion that's about net zero, because this phrase really frustrates me and worries me that we will miss the much bigger transformation we need to make, which is to realize that we live on a delicately balanced living planet. There are 9 life-supporting systems or planetary boundaries on which we depend. Yes, a stable climate, and healthy oceans, and fertile soil, and abundant biodiversity, and recharging fresh water. London is at risk of water scarcity. We should be talking as much about water as net zero. We should be talking as much about biodiversity and the web of life as carbon emissions. So we need a lot more than a kind of a single focus on carbon to go with our single focus on GDP and a year that we set it by. So I'm just going to rebel against that. We need to decarbonize and dematerialize our economies. They have to happen together, because otherwise everyone says we're going to get free renewable energy and then we can carry on as is and we'll carry on growing. But just looking around at us, at the materials in this room, the wood, the concrete, the clothes we're wearing, the food we've eaten, the energy that's powering us. The world is material intensive, and London is a hugely material intensive city with impacts on the world. We need to have a circular or cyclical economy as much as we need a decarbonized economy, and that must be as much of the conversation as net zero or decarbonizing. And I can hear you agreeing, yeah. So I would really like to shift the debate to a much broader context of moving from thinking that well-being is growth to thriving in balance, meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet.
Thank you, Kate. Thank goodness we didn't miss that. And I'm so sorry. That was completely my fault, so I hugely apologise. I'm always struck by discussions of net zero exactly in the terms you've set out, which is it would be very easy. Well, it wouldn't be very easy, but it would be very simple to ground the planes, park the cars, and just stop that kind of human progress that has defined certainly the 20th century. Presuming that we can't do that, and that a move to net zero is also progress in some way, how would you start that next phase of not growth but progress? How would you begin that? What would you do first? Please, yeah, please.
Well, all right, then I'll quickly stick a slide up on the screen behind us. I'm going to jump. Oh, there's what we need to leave behind. Here's the donut. I'm not going to run into a big presentation. There is the world. This is what we need to turn around. Okay, all right, I'll jump up. We need to unroll the donut. Don't go everywhere. Okay, I'm going to do this one bit. What would it mean for London to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet? That's the question we should be asking. That's the question actually that I know is resonating in this room. If we unroll this and open up space between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling of this donut, we can go inside. This is the question that I believe is being asked again and again in different panels by different people. How can London become a home to thriving people? in a thriving place, while still respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? That's a big, complex question, and that's why we sometimes move too quickly to calling for net zero. But we can break it down into 4 questions, and I'll just reveal these. So the first question, let's start here. How can all the people of London thrive? And of course, that was what the last panel was talking about so powerfully. How can we ensure that everybody here has food? Many people were talking about families choosing, do I eat or do my kids eat? There is a crisis of food, health, education, housing. We heard 16% of people in London live in substandard housing. Do we have income and work? We heard that half of people in poverty have somebody in work. A crisis of peace and justice. 30-something% of people don't trust the police. So we were hearing in the last panel some of London's problems here. How can we ensure that everybody meets the essentials of well-being? Add to that a local aspiration for London to reflect and be part of her nearby nature. This city is built in an ecosystem of nature that here has figured out how to thrive. Nature figured out how to sequester carbon, store water and cool the air and house biodiversity. How can this city be built and rebuilt and remodeled and redesigned in ways that invite that too? Yes, there's a plan to be a national park city, but we know that biodiversity has been falling here. London's prone to flash floods. Nature doesn't do flash floods. Nature absorbs water. How can the pavements become permeable so that that future water crisis is actually avoided? So we make London a place that protects and uses her water. How can we bring biodiversity back? These are London's local aspirations. But let's remember, we're in one of the most powerful and richest cities in one of the richest countries on the planet. So there are problems within, but this is a phenomenal city with huge impacts worldwide. So London also, to be fair, not only fair to Londoners, London has responsibilities to the world. London has a responsibility to respect the health of the whole planet, to come back within planetary boundaries. And here's net zero and beyond. Here's coming back within our material footprint. Here's reducing London's use of timber and land and fertilizer and materials and London's production of plastics and pollution. How? Every country, every city has this challenge. How to come back within planetary boundaries? Because no city's done it yet. And how can London respect the well-being of people worldwide? The people who produce the clothes we wear. Are they from Bangladesh or Vietnam or China? We are connected to those people in our lives every day. The businesses that do business in London, they fund fossil fuels, they fund mining, they fund industries that are undermining the human rights of people worldwide. That's part of London's responsibility. We know that the way we live now is having impacts on climate change and literally pushing people to face climate impacts today. And how does London welcome those who come in crisis, who come forced from their own homes to here? How does London welcome those seeking refuge as a culture and as a policy? So these are just some examples from all of these 4 lenses. And I will briefly say that we're working with cities around the world and nations that have chosen to adopt this framework and put it into practice, whether it's Amsterdam, which Georgia mentioned, who've made a nice Dutch donut, in orange of course, to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. What if every capital city in the world and others said, yes, this is our 21st century goal, of course. And how do we put that into practice in our housing, in our clothing, in our food systems? How do we become circular? And how do we enable citizens to show that the projects and the initiatives that they're already doing feed into this? Barcelona have taken the concept and actually, look, you can see they've unrolled the donut and they're collecting that data systematically, saying we're not going to measure our future by GDP. That doesn't tell us about us and our thriving and ourselves. We're going to use these metrics that actually show us the lived experience here and our impacts worldwide. We're going to make this a community conversation. Let's go to Scandinavia, why not? Oslo, Groenlika, they redeveloped a harbour and they said we're going to use this framework to think, how can we respect the needs and well-being of the people who are going to live here, respect local ecology? Can we do that in a way that comes back within planetary boundaries and respects people in global supply chains? Let's have the ambition to do that. And I've got to finally go to one city a few train stops away. Amazing work going on by Civic Square in Birmingham, who are using these concepts to do a street level retrofit. So, also, there has been a first go at doing London City Portrait. The London Donut Economy Group, led by Chris Paddock and others, came together and actually started gathering data saying, well, the city's not running this yet. We're going to have a go. I really welcome you and recommend you look at their report that looks at the data for London. What would it look like for the city, the government here, to take this and say, we're going to bring together all the stats we have, all the plans and the strategies, and actually bring them into this one holistic view, so that we can ask ourselves, how do we come to thrive and stop talking endlessly about growth? What would it mean for this city to show leadership? With the Mayor of London as the leader of the C40 at the moment, this is an amazing opportunity to show leadership. This is what a 21st city aims for. We aim to thrive, not endlessly grow. So I leave you with London's local aspirations, global responsibilities. What would it mean to thrive in this space? Net zero is a part of it, but the picture is much, much bigger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. If that's you thrown off, then wow. And I apologise again. Roxanne, if I may bring you in as Mayor of Newham, elected Mayor of Newham, I wonder if you might comment on I suppose, that bottom left quadrant of Kate's graphic, local aspirations, and how you see this debate and this challenge trickle down or come up from, I should say, your constituents.
Firstly, I'd say thank you. I'd also invite everyone in the audience to receive what's been said as another wake-up call, and also to convey that what you've set out isn't new to us. If you look at the country of Bhutan, since the early 1970s, it's adopted and appropriated a similar lens through its Health, Wellbeing, Happiness Index, which has informed international thinking, both at the United Nations and elsewhere. And we should also look at countries like New Zealand that have adopted their living standards framework to inform their health and wellbeing budget back in 2019. The Welsh Government that has been thinking about not just the health and wellbeing within the framework of what you've set out of current generations, but also future generations, having introduced a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act back in 2019. But also in England and Wales, the UK government actually under the auspices of the ONS, as far back as 2010, commenced with its National Wellbeing Programme, aiming to create a measure of national wellbeing to supplement the limiting objective metrics that we use to measure success. And you're right, the growth, as we've understood it, is redundant in the context of the limitations of our global environment that we impart in very minuscule ways, both in London and in Newham, we occupy. So locally, all those quadrants are important to us in Newham, and we deploy them through a framework of health, wellbeing and happiness that we've adopted as a local authority. And I think we're the first local authority in the country to integrate it into our measurement baseline. And we've started asking questions through our our Newham household survey to begin to really illuminate what it is that our people want. We've been limited and we've been constrained because there's only so much we can do as a unitary authority in the capital that operates within the framework of a regional authority and then 4 sub-regional authorities. And there's too much time, frankly, being wasted having to negotiate competing priorities of the old world, which is underpinned by the growth economics that you've illuminated on very passionately, and the life that we want our residents to lead, not least because in Newham we have a population profile that is perhaps the most diverse of any local authority in the country. We have some 222 languages and dialects spoken. We literally have a community with people that have a connection to every single part of the world. So this donut economy concept, which they live and breathe in the global south, day in, day out, is something that can be leveraged in order to galvanise the people movement that we need at a local level. But we are also a unitary authority that can't control who steps in and out of our boundaries, and we have to work with other local authorities, and rightly so. But I think this is an important pivot moment for London and for localities in the capital when we seriously consider both the human and non-human planetary health and operationalise that at a very local, hyper level.
Thank you. And Dimitri, just picking up on that point, from your experience and what you've seen elsewhere, on a regional or even a national scale, what should we be starting to do to make those changes?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I ought to pick up on the GDP point as well. I mean, I think you're both absolutely right. There is this ludicrous obsession with GDP. It doesn't measure a lot of what we care about in terms of well-being, in terms of happiness, in terms of the Aristotelian good life, in terms of inalienable rights, equal opportunities, etc., etc. Though to some extent, in some instances, it can be correlated. It certainly doesn't measure wealth, which is a disastrous omission. And that's why I'm working in Cambridge on a team that looks at measuring natural capital, but also social capital, amongst other things. Because if you're not looking at the ideas, the people, and the environment, and you're not safeguarding it, you can run down the environment, for example, boost GDP, and because it's a flow concept, not a stock concept, like wealth, it does not build in sustainability, and that's a major problem. So we really need to move away from this obsession with GDP. But I think it's an obsession that can cut both ways. It's very rare that you get kind of left-wing environmentalists and right-wing climate skeptics agree on something. And one thing that they universally agree on, completely falsely in my view, is that you either grow or you safeguard the environment. The right will tell you, well, that's why we can't afford the luxury of safeguarding the environment, because it means we lose our jobs and our wages, and it hits ordinary, Middle Englanders and all the rest of it. And on the environmentalist side, you'll hear that, well, we simply can't safeguard the environment without growing. Now, if you were to live within a planet a day and reduce emissions to net zero and do everything that's required to live sustainably, it's not obvious that growth would stop. In fact, actually, that's the last thing you'd expect to happen. You'd have to live every day within your same resource envelope. What would you do? You just get cleverer and cleverer at using the resources you have, because ideas, unlike material goods, and Kate's absolutely right, we cannot go on abusing and raping the earth of its material resources and its renewable resources, which is even more important: the biodiversity, the forests, the fisheries, which when they reach a certain threshold may irreversibly deplete and never return. And we rely on these systems. So it's about way more than just climate. But if we did live within our limits, ideas, unlike physical things and resources, are limitless. In fact, it's better than that. Ideas build on ideas. We just get cleverer and cleverer and cleverer at using the limited resources we have. So we need tough standards, we need regulations, we need taxing pollution, we need to ban deforestation, we need to do it quickly and ambitiously.
And then I think we'll start having the right kind of growth. Because when people are employed not to produce ever more flat screen TVs and iPhones, but actually to restore forests, to protect fisheries, to reduce pollution, and to stop mining for all the goods and services that those activities require, they will fall within what's called the production boundary, and they'll start popping up in GDP. The only reason they're not in GDP now is a political choice. We choose to ignore those things that we care about, and so we don't create markets, and so people aren't employed in doing the right things to preserve our environment and our society, and instead are employed to dig up ever more material resources to feed an ever-growing consumer demand. So we need to dematerialize and stop obsessing about growth. We don't know what the impact on growth will be. In fact, I would argue that probably the only sustainable growth path is a net zero, resource efficient growth path. All the others are doomed to failure.
Thank you. Kate, I wonder if just you could comment on that. And you flashed up some examples of places that you're working around the world and cities that are doing some great things. Are there any examples of places that have recalibrated their priorities and have implemented policy changes that you think are on that right path?
Well, there's lots of places that are certainly saying we need a vision of a new thriving future, but where I think Dimitri and I differ is I have not seen any evidence of any nation, let alone city, that is decarbonizing at the speed and scale required at all.
Completely agree.
Right, and I don't believe I don't believe that that's going to be possible with the pursuit of an endlessly growing economy. So what we have seen is about 30 high-income countries have reduced their carbon emissions over the last, say, 20 years, but they're falling at about 1%, at best 2% a year. And it needs to be more like 8 to 10% a year. So it's like saying I'm running for the bus, but actually just doing a slow jog. Like, you're going to miss that bus. So we're doing a slow jog, and we need to sprint. And my great concern is that if we always talk about sustainable growth or net zero growth, because we want both these things, right? They're both so desirable. If we want them both, and it turns out it's not possible to have them both, when push comes to shove, you can bet which one is going to be shoved. It's going to be the stability of the climate. It's going to be the health of the planet, because the design of our economy is so strongly locked into pursuing growth, and the role of politicians to keep promising growth, growth, growth. You get it, literally those words from both sides of the political parties in this country, which I find very alarming, that growth will always come before life. And it's time to reverse that.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and I will just say, I'm just talking about carbon emissions at that point. If we then go and look at the impact of material use, that decoupling hasn't even begun.
That's a great segue to a first question from the crowd, actually, which and Roxanne, I'm going to come to you first on this, if you don't mind. Mindful of the noisy pushback against the ULEZ and LTN's relatively minor measures in this context, how would we get the panel to actually address these concerns so that we can get to net zero? We do, after all, live in a democracy, and presumably, Mayor Fiaz, politicians like you want to be re-elected, and some of these are going to be unpopular things to do.
A lot of what I've been doing in Newham has been unpopular. We've got to help as part of the just transition that we aspire to wean our resident populations and our voter constituencies away from the addiction of growth economies and what they've been sold. It's as simple as that, and we have to demonstrate the bravery as political leadership class, either at local, regional or national level. And we've got to understand that the ideologically driven polarisation that's been played out like a sick game is inducing a lot of our resident populations into a state of switching off from politics. And here's the thing, reflecting what you both said, a short while ago, growth in the context of Newham, and arguably for marginalised communities in London and communities of colour, predominantly in London, has failed. I have a resident population where we've had wage stagnation for the best part of the last 15 years. And growth, as has been flatlining nationally for the past decade, hasn't really been a concern of our resident population because they're struggling to survive. And trying to make those arguments, they get it at a certain level, but when communities are holding on to symbols of what are elevated to be progress and you've arrived, i.e. cars, that doesn't help. And we've got to be much more bolder and braver in defending concepts such as 15-minute neighbourhoods and the shift in travel modality from cars to walking and to cycling, and to present it in ways that don't manifest or are experienced as existential threats to already minoritized and marginalized communities.
Kate and Dimitri, I'm going to come to both of you on a couple of sort of linked questions. So the top one from Sadie Hodgson, she says, SMEs make up over 90% of London's businesses. How can we better support them to adopt donut economics and deliver net zero? And I suppose a sort of linked question, which is, well, from Hal Kanoum, who says, Leeds recently launched Leeds Donut City. There's an action lab in Birmingham. Why is London behind on adopting these principles? And I would add, is London behind first? And then, if so, why? And in terms of the question about small businesses, I think that's if you could maybe expand on that to think about what we can do on the ground from a grassroots level across the city. As we've talked about, we don't have a huge amount of central power here. Kate.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So one of the tools that we use with all the cities that are using the framework that I just described, the first thing they say, quite rightly, is we really need to redesign our own organizations and think deeply about power and our institutions if we're going to make these transformations. And one of the questions that comes right up is wealth and the ownership of wealth. So who owns the sources of wealth creation? And it's sitting in this room all the time. Who owns the land in this city? Who owns the housing? How is it owned? How are the businesses owned? You know, in the city of Vienna, over 60% of people live in housing that is what we would call social housing. It's owned by the city, it's affordable, it's central, it's normal, it's good quality, because a century ago, Vienna decided that housing is not an investment asset for those with too much money trying to find out how to make the latest additional percentage. Oh, I'll buy 100 units in London. Housing is a human right. And so they decided that housing in their city should be owned in service of being a human right. How do we ensure, not just in this city, across the UK, how do we ensure that housing and water and transport and energy are owned and serve in service to the public good? So on businesses, how do we ensure that small enterprises are supported? How do you make sure that, and some cities that have adopted the donut are using, for example, their impact hub, where they're supporting startups to tax reductions for, or tax subsidies for companies that are employee-owned or cooperatively owned, because those are sticky. They stick around because they're owned by someone who lives here, who has family here, the workers part of this place. So recognizing that the 21st century it not only has to be regenerative, it has to be distributive. If we can have more small and employee-owned. In the city of Atlanta in the US, there are 5 times more black-owned businesses than any surrounding city. Why? Because the city decided to make it happen, and they supported those entrepreneurs and they enabled them to get their own business, and that transforms who owns a share of this economy. So always when we talk about growth, whose growth? And in Newnham, those communities you're talking about, they absolutely should have a growth of their income in their health outcomes, in their education outcomes. So it's moving away from the macro GDP growth about bringing everybody above that social foundation into spaces of well-being. Of course, we want to see some things grow, but move away from imagining that it'll always turn up as growth in market sales at the macro level.
Thank you. Dimitri, anything to add to Kate's response?
Yeah, no, again, I agree with the bulk of that. One thing we do have in London is we've got this financial services sector, which handles a lot of money. A lot of that goes into financing the consumer economy that Kate and I both see as the source of a lot of the problems we have. Some of it actually goes to fund sustainable activities, some genuine, some less so, but some genuine sustainable activities in cities like Paris and Frankfurt and even Kuala Lumpur. It's not funding a huge amount in this city, and that's because we don't have a huge pipeline, despite kind of laudable aspirations. We don't have a huge pipeline of scaled up projects in housing, in transport, in infrastructure. And part of that reflects, the limited devolved powers that the mayor has. So one of the things that we worked on as part of the London Sustainable Development Committee, working with the GLA, is we proposed the setting up of a London Future Finance Committee, Future Finance Facility, which basically says, look, there is all this available finance. There's only so much the mayor can do. But if we work with local authorities, with the GLA and with Whitehall to point to some of the activities that could be undertaken and could not only potentially boost London's economy by providing new jobs, by boosting efficiency, by boosting innovation, and by also providing greater inclusion and equality, because you spread a lot. Some of the people in the worst housing stock are those who can least afford the bills. You can then allow financial services to provide some of that finance, because they are actually quite keen to do so, because they are, for good or ill, they're under pressure to do some.
ESG
well, let's
criteria,
do it
don't they?
here. And if we put a viable case, and we've got big finance saying, look, we've got the money, and we've got local authorities, and we've got the GLA saying, look, these are the projects that urgently need the finance. Not only can you create the kind of environment and society that we want, but actually you create high-skilled, high-paid jobs. You start showing through leadership that London's a green city. It's not going fast enough, but sustainability and decarbonisation is the way the 21st century is going to go. By hook or by crook, that is how we're going to go. And if London shows that it can provide the finance, the engineering, the consultancy, all sorts of services that London excels at, you'll find that some of the most innovative, progressive, and productive businesses will start moving to London, or start looking to London to provide the advice for the rest of the world. And we're missing that opportunity.
Elizabeth Campbell earlier mentioned the Opportunity London initiative, which is exactly that, inviting sustainable investment into London for any investors looking for those responsible long-term returns. So I should just say that. A couple more minutes for a couple more questions. The top voted one from David Calver: what will London's response be to sea level rise as we overshoot Paris, the 1.5 target? And will London increase flood defences or do fighting withdrawal up the contours? Nicely phrased. Roxana, perhaps come to you as one of London's political representatives. So I presume you have had flooding in Newham. There's been flooding all over the capital as well as other parts of the UK. I suppose the question is, what has your response been, and what do you think the city's response will be?
Yes, we have had flooding. We sit on the Rodin River line, not as bad as Waltham Forest. There's something that is really important around the materials that we use and the instruments that we can leverage, be it through various strategies that we're developing around flood defence, but also planning, cancelling out on non-permeability materials, an obsession with concreting over front lawns for driveways. That's led to areas that in Newham that 60 years ago wouldn't have been subject to flooding because of flash rain now sort of drowning households. Not literally, but you get the meaning. So there's a number of things that can be done and are required to be done under the planning regime in the UK. And I would also add that we should be encouraging people to consider not only issues of permeability, but also materials and how we can contribute to the biodiversity of our places, i.e. enabling and investing in the public realm and in green, and how we as local authorities can use our investment power in order to enable that. So Newham's a £1.5 billion local authority. We actually rank in the top 15 highest land ownership in the country, and the power that we have through procurement, diversifying our supply chain, and requiring through our commissions and contractual frameworks what we're expecting contractors and companies to be doing, and then setting the bar high in terms of what we're procuring, but also making it really clear for people that want to be doing business in Newham, these are the minimum that we are expecting.
Thank you. And Kate, I'm just going to come to you for a last word, as I feel I owe you at least that. In sort of 10 words or less, really, what can we, if you could kind of ask everyone in this room to do one thing or to talk about one thing, what would it be?
Realise that the shape of progress is not endless growth, it's thriving in balance.
There we go. Look at that. Thank you so much. She was well up to the challenge. Thank you all. Thank you to all our brilliant panellists for today. And thank you to you all for your brilliant questions throughout the day. I'm going to hand over to Chief Exec Nick Bowes to take us to lunch.
Thank you. It falls to me to stand between you and your lunch, so I'll be very quick. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, either in the room or online. Thank you very much to our speakers and all of our contributors today. We've had some very interesting perspectives put to us today, which I think are going to be the source of a lot of conversations over lunch. Thank you to the sponsors for today, our principal sponsor, the Central District Alliance, but also our supporting sponsors, London City Airport and the Crown Estate. Please do keep the conversation going on Twitter using the hashtag #LondonNext. Don't forget, you can join the supporters network. Materials are out there in the foyer while you're having your lunch. It'd be a fantastic way to help us do more of the work that we do. And do come and talk to me or any of my colleagues or any of my fellow trustees who are here today if you're interested in being the next Chief Executive of Centre for London. We've now got an hour to continue all of the discussions that have been going on this morning, and I invite you all to come and join us for lunch in the entrance. Thank you, everybody.